me softly, I have to choose. Should I leave or should I stay with you? I am addicted, we are too close. One more day and I'll overdose. Killing me softly, I gotta choose. Keep my life or lose myself in you. I'm so addicted, it has to end. But why do I keep holding your hand? I am stuck and I'm hypnotized. Visions of you come and stay the entire night. My mind is buried, rescue out of sight. Crazy me, what do I not see? That you are living poison in my veins. Put the needle in me so that I feel free. I let loose, give you the key. Pray that you'll be dead to me. Ashamed, this is my destiny. Crazy me, what do I not see? That you are living poison in my veins. Put the needle in me so that I feel free. I let loose, give you the key. Pray that you'll be dead to me.
What time it is? Marvin Devine, Huber, Axel, and you know how we do.
Yeah, I got the juice, yeah, I got the juice. Big game cool, make them look like cool. Always play cool, that's the biggest rule. Forget what they doing, keep on doing. I've been making loot since like 22. Ask me how I made it right here in the booth. I'm always good cause of what I pursue. That's greatness, yeah, I gotta make it, I got things to lose. Boy, you wanna get in my crew, boy, you can't get in my crew. Me, XL, and Hoover, way too fireball. When this joint drop, better call the troops. And when you hear the drop, better raise the roof. Better raise the roof. You already know what happens when we link up. Let's go. Yeah, I got the juice. Yeah, I got the juice. Whip game cool, make them look like cool. Always play it cool, that's the biggest rule. Forget what they doing, keep on doing so.
Writers write what they know. Liars write what they wanna show. Singers sing what they told. But I know you got something else to say. A secret language speaking in tongues. Snake like tongue tied, you on the run. Tribal dancing, I don't know what you are, you are, you are, you are. Summer solding over my heart. We're both dancing over the dark side. I don't know who you are, you are, you are, you are. You got letters sprinkled all over your body. If I join up the dots, it makes me feel naughty. I feel like I shouldn't touch. You gotta know touch and sign. I feel like I shouldn't run. You're blocking the exit with your life. Addicted to light, center, always in the limelight. Show ya a real good time. Oh, I know you got something else for me. A secret language speaking in tongues. Snake like tongue tied, you on the run. Tribal dancing, I don't know what you are, you are, you are, you are. Summer solding over my heart. We're both dancing over the dark side. I don't know who you are, you are, you are, you are. Letters sprinkled all over your body. If I join up the dots, it makes me feel naughty. I feel like I shouldn't touch. You gotta know touch and sign. I feel like I shouldn't run. You're blocking the exit with your life. Touch and sign. You're blocking the exit with your life.
Can you give me what I need? Just give me what I want, baby. Can you give me what I need? Just give me what I want. Just give me what I want. Give me what I'm looking for.
things that you said, cause I wish you didn't mean it. I'm under attack, running far, far away, and I'd rather keep my distance from you. You don't gotta lie to me to get through. Push and pull me off into the deep, and let's pretend that nothing ever happened on that night. I shouldn't have spoke, cause you didn't feel the same way about me, and it's eating me alive all of the time. So I'd rather keep my distance from you. You don't gotta lie to me to get through. Push and pull me off into the deep, and let's pretend that nothing ever happened on that night.
Warriors around, don't get caught in the mosh pit. Fuel to the fire, ain't nobody can stop it. Trouble in my city, but you know I'm across it. Got a 40 on my hip and I'm liable to spark it. Throw down these hits, my click is indivisible. I aim, you duck, I squeeze, now you invisible. I'm not afraid of getting physical. All these different chemicals are fogging up my visuals. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Yo, we notorious, we ain't no runners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Yo, we some warriors, they ain't called gunners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Put on my strap, put on the beat, put on the map, put on my team. Take out every motherfucker in between. Know what I mean? Better myself, better my aim, better my rap, better my name. Killing rappers on my hang, I'm by their chains for the fame. Never thought I would it, now I'm running this. You don't wanna follow me, now I'm in front of this. I ran in the jungle with the truth, trying to get it what it does. Battling and I ain't never lose. We some motherfucking warriors. Cover the map and still ain't know where you can find me at. Journey through the mind of an insomniac. I ain't never sleep, staying ready, keep an eye out for the fakes. For the snakes, load a clip and I'ma pull it, something shakes. Never go to battle if you plan to lose. Life a game of chess, you gotta plan the moves. Middle fingers up, I'm not a fan of rules. Fighting for the right to live in peace and not like animals.
Bloods in my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Yo, we notorious, we ain't no runners. Bloods in my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Yo, we some warriors, they ain't no gunners. Bloods in my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Bloods in my hands, got slugs on my gunners.
Put on my strap, put on the beam, put on the map, put on my team. Take out every motherfucker in between. Know what I mean? Better myself, better my aim, better my rap, better my name. Killing rappers on my hang, I'm by their chains for the fame. Never thought I would it, now I'm running this. You don't wanna follow me, now I'm running this. I ran in the jungle with the truth, trying to get it what it does. Battling and I ain't never lose. We some motherfucking warriors.
They all thought I wouldn't make it. They all think that you're faking, but seeing ain't believing. I know now. I'd take all your stupid, burn it as my fuel, yeah. 'Cause we're running out of time, so I'm gonna make it mine.
The chosen one, I'm not the one to underestimate. I want the throne, I learned to crush obstruction, rush through barricades, levitate. Got it tatted on me, told them follow me. They see the vision, now it's 2020, clear as tile laces, clear as day. No longer move around in fear, disarray. Pray you hear me like the winter wind against your window pane. Feel the bass, baby, soak it in and let it marinate. It's time to hustle, gotta muscle up and run through barricades, yeah. Obstruction, rush through barricades, levitate. Got it tatted on me, told them follow me. They see the vision, now it's 2020, clear as tile laces, clear as day. No longer move around in fear, disarray. Pray you hear me like the winter wind against your window pane. Feel the bass, baby, soak it in and let it marinate. It's time to hustle, gotta muscle up and run through barricades, yeah.
I got their opinions, and I got mine. I used to care what you said about me. Now I ain't got the time. Taking on to take a seat, it's okay. Try to get in touch, see if you know me. Still got the love, nothing's changed. Gotta play that game. 'Cause we're running out of time. So I gotta make it, so I gotta make it. So I gotta make it mine. I'm still waiting for the answers to the universe, waiting for someone to wake me up, tell me that this is all just a dream. I'm still waiting for a different sign, waiting for someone to take me away, get these thoughts off my mind. As I wait, thinking of you, hoping that you are thinking of me too. I cannot sleep without you by me, and I miss you, I miss you, I miss
The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
Hello. Well, I hope everything is working fine. If there is any issue as usual, just let me know. This time, I didn't send the mailing list to everyone. So I guess if you're on the stream now, it means that either you're a speaker or you're watching the tweet, or you actually subscribe to the channel. And actually, even if you check on the website now, I moved the oh, that's kind of crap. I was about to say, like, I moved the YouTube view, which apparently, like, the Twitch one only works from time to time. But if you rather be on YouTube rather than Twitch, the link is available on the actual Twitter account. I'm wondering if the view is not working. Yeah, actually, I think maybe it's because in incognito mode it does not show it, actually, because it does work on my regular session. It's good to know. So I hope you're all doing well for this 9th edition, as Sima just reminded us in the chat. Actually, I can probably even show it here. It was hidden. Yeah, so this is the 9th edition out of a series of 10. So in 2 weeks, it's going to be the last edition, I think. At least for that season, then I will take a break. Maybe I will do something like a bit more casual instead of just like a once every 2 weeks type of thing. So far, after like 9 episodes on YouTube, I think we have like around like 800-ish subscribers. I guess it's an average of like like 100 per episode. But I don't know if we're gonna get to the 1000 by the 10th episode. I guess we will see. And on Twitch, it's even more difficult to get followers. But I think like people are more used to like more regular content. So I guess that's my feedback, as from the actual. Oh, it works fine on your incognito view. Okay, interesting. I guess it's a bit random then, because it says failed to load on my thing. But the great thing is like you can have the chat on the side and stuff. Although like the YouTube one is probably more convenient because unlike gamers, I guess everyone has a YouTube account. But it's quite difficult to get like subscribers on YouTube and Twitch compared to Twitter. Although on Twitter now, I guess it's also becoming like more difficult than before because there's so many people. And I think there's also like less viewers now because like confinement is being lifted in a bunch of places. For instance, us in Dubai now, like the confinement is like very, very limited. We just have to wear a mask when we go outside. I think something in France, I don't think there's like a really enforced like confinement, unless you're traveling or coming inside the country. But yeah, so thanks for joining us for this 9th episode. I think Jaziel, you're one of the like strong supporter. I think you've been here from if probably like the first or like the second episode, and you've been attending all of them. Thanks for the support. It's quite nice. That's always good to see. I do think like the format though. I do like the format. I would say I wish like more people would like benefit from it, because I don't know, like in terms of viewers, it's not doing that much. I would say like regular like webinars and I don't know, like ransomwares would like probably do like more views, maybe because it's more accessible, So I'm wondering if like the content is like too niche or not, but at the same time, I would say that's what brings like a quality audience, which is quite good, especially like nowadays, I would say. And the flexibility, I think, is kind of cool. Like, so I was talking with Mohammed, who's gonna speak after on malware HTTP communication channels, And for instance, like he said, he prepared slides. He has a white paper that he's gonna publish after, so we're gonna put it on the GitHub. So that's quite cool. And Patrick is gonna come with like his blog post and read the blog post, which is also what I did last time when I made my GitHub repository public for my ARM64 like exploit. So I think it's kind of cool to have like a more like flexible format, because I don't know if any of you remember, but every time we had to submit something to a FRAC, or people wanted to submit to a FRAC, you never knew when was going to be the next edition. And then at some point, like, which is not a bad thing, you know, they kind of were a bit more like picky on the type of writing, and, you know, they wanted it to be like a bit cleaner, which, like, knowing the backstory, you know, it definitely makes sense because of all the stuff they had. But yeah, I think I still like the format of like, okay, if you have something cool, you can present it, you know, whatever format you like. Let me know what you think about the format, and what could also be done for the last OPCODE Live, which would be on July 29. So in 2 weeks. I think we're probably gonna have like 1 or 2 roundtable, maybe like at least 1 talk. And if there is more stuff like coming up, you know, like we'll probably just like add it to that one, I guess. But yeah, if there is like anyone you would like to see or stuff you would like to have presented, yeah, definitely let me know for that last episode, which is like in 2 weeks. I guess it's gonna arrive soon, because if you think about it, the first OPCODE I think was like 25th of March already, so I guess it has been like 4 months already. So it does go back like very quickly. And yeah, and since life is going back to normal now, so I don't know if it's still worth like continuing the thing or not. Definitely let me know. Anyway, like as I was saying, we're always on the Discord channel, so definitely more than happy to hear more feedback around it. But yeah, so without further ado, because I think I've said all the stuff I wanted to say for that time, definitely come subscribe if you didn't yet, you know. So you cannot subscribe, say like 8:30. So all the presentations are still here in case you missed any of the previous editions. So as usual, you know, we take the live stream and then we cut it, do some cleaning, put all the content here. Definitely in 4 months, definitely got more content than in 3 years of OPCODE, I would say, because yeah, I guess that's like 10 editions, like between 3 and 4 talks every time, so that's between 30 and 40 talks. I guess that's the equivalent of like 2-3 conference. So that's pretty good. Definitely thanks to everyone who has been speaking, and even we've had some returning speakers. So Costin was the main returning speakers at some point, but for like this episode, it's kind of cool. We have 2 returning speakers. So we have Mohamed and Patrick. So yeah, that means a lot, because it also means like speakers also having a good experience, they enjoy the format, and I personally also, as like a speaker, I do think it's much better because you don't have to wait. For instance, like what I was presenting last week, there's some research I did 2 weeks prior it. Then as soon as I was done, I just presented it, and that's it, you know, with my blog post. Otherwise, you would have to wait like 3 months to be accepted in a conference. So I do feel like it's definitely more efficient as a medium to share the data or information. And we're probably going to see more of it. So, but the main people who I've seen were doing some pretty good streams were all the bug bounty people. Super active on Discord, super active on Twitch, and people are like, yeah, really really active. So I don't know if this is because it's less niche than that. Also, I'm definitely sure they're making a much better job at promoting, because it was not really the priority. Like also the idea is to also grow organically, you know, without pushing too much on getting like additional viewers to see how organically it could be done. But yeah, they've done it like pretty well. Other than that, all the people doing like virtual conferences so far, I mean, I'm sure you would all agree, like over the past 4 months, we did have seen a lot of those virtual events. It was a bit too much. I mean, it is still too much, you know, like there's something like almost every day, and a lot of stuff is not really, I would say not really relevant. And whenever there's like some cool stuff is like really late. But yeah, so without further ado, I will let Mohamed get ready, so you can share your screen and everything. And yeah, so we can hear. I didn't check the slide, although I received them in advance. I just wanted to get the surprise for it, so I can ask the questions at the same time as I am watching the presentation. But yeah, so is gonna be talking about some new malware. I don't know if this is one malware or collection on malware using similar like communication techniques. But yeah, that should be quite cool. So I'm just gonna launch the transition and then we can go.
The future is watching. Welcome to OPCODE Virtual Summit.
All right. Hi, all. Can you hear me, Matt? Yeah, awesome. So, okay, my name is Mohamed Mukbel. I'm a second-time presenter at OPCODE. It was too good first time not to do it another time with another research. Today, yeah, no, I won't. That's okay. It is too tempting to do it, but last minute decision not to do it.
yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
No worries. So today I'll be talking about a journey into malware HTTP communication channels spectacular. It's a journey, meaning that it's based on my own experience, like at least for the last 10 years, in reverse engineering different malware communication channels, client and server-wise. And in particular here, the focus is on HTTP, not HTTPS or any other custom protocol, be it ASCII or binary. So it's going to be interesting, and I'm pretty sure that you will see stuff that before, at least this is my expectation. You might have seen like blogs here and there talking about some of the stuff, but definitely not to the depth that I'll be going into, and this particular research. And to mention it, like right at the beginning, there will be a full technical paper talking about everything that I'll be talking about in this presentation. So you don't have to worry about taking notes or scratching your heads or whatnot. The technical paper goes into full details into every case that I'll be addressing in this talk. So a bit about me. I'm a senior security researcher at Trend Micro. I'm a member of the Digital Vaccine Lab. If you haven't heard of us, we do, it's part of Tipping Point, and we work on IDS/IPS solution. We write filters, reverse engineer malwares and vulnerabilities. And my interests lie in the area of reverse engineering and malware research, intrusion detection and prevention systems, and I have a special interest in C++ language, and in particular the compiler and software development and performance analysis. And as you can tell from the talk, I'm also interested in exotic communication protocols, not only specific to malware, but communication protocols in general. So I have a bit of a critical mindset when it comes to reversing protocols or even just reading the specifications. So I like to dabble into this area as well. Introduction. So as I mentioned at the beginning, oh, yeah, gotcha. Okay, for the introduction, as I mentioned, the talk will be about malware communication protocols. And I know you must have reverse engineered malware CNC communication channel, or if you've read a blog post or whatnot. At the end of the day, once the malware is in the wild, its goal is to reach out to a command and control server to receive commands, exfiltrate data, and do whatever nefarious activities on the infected system. That's the whole purpose of having a CNC channel. Now, it could be using either a TCP layer or UDP layer, depending on the protocol, and be it like a custom or a standard protocol. On TCP, you could be using, for example, IRC, SMTP, FTP, HTTP, HTTPS, SMB protocol, DNS, ICMP, SSL, or TLS. Of course, malware could use like any other protocol. It's not specific to those that I'm just listing. But those are standards, and the malware could leverage them easily without having to innovate on coming up with their own custom protocols. Now, this is an example that shows how a custom protocol that is ASCII-based is constructed at the packet level. For example, we have this packet, which consists of the following pipe delimited data. It is very simple. First, we have, for example, the word God, which is could indicate a magic string. It's used like as a unique identifier that the malware server would be expecting when the malware sends this request to the server. And then followed by the infected system OS version, then the pipe character, then the host name of the infected system, then the username of the currently logged in account, then followed by the OS bitness, be it 32-bit or 64-bit. So this is a very simple ASCII-based protocol that a lot of malware use when they want to fingerprint the infected system and send such a packet to the backend server. The other example is also a custom protocol, but is binary-based. And one of the most famous custom binary-based protocol is the one used by PCRAT, which is also known as GhostRat, although it's not GhostRat, it's just that the magic byte is set to the word ghost, but there is no rat known as GhostRat. This is the source code is open source, and the original name of the rat is PCRAT, just to set this straight from the beginning. And the structure of this packet in binary format is as follows. First, you have the first 5 bytes. It's in hex. And they have the word PCRAT in ASCII. So this is a unique identifier that you set at compile time when you want to generate a malware sample via the builder of PCRAT. And then what comes after is a double word value that would indicate the packet size. And then another double word value, which indicates the size of the data that follows, but before zlib compression. And then what follows after that, for example, you have the 789C is the header for the zlib compression library, and then the zlib compressed data. So this is a perfect example of how a binary custom protocol looks like. And this is not like unique in any form or shape. Many other malware custom protocol follow a similar pattern as well. You will be surprised to see that such a pattern also exists with other malware families too. They might have a byte here, byte there, that would indicate different flags depending on the malware configuration. But at the end of the day, they all sort of follow the same structure. Okay, so also still in the introduction section. So at the beginning, you must be aware, back in the days, IRC was sort of like the de facto protocol for malware. Why? Because it was very easy to just set up an IRC server and have your malware communicate with it without having to invest into setting up the backend component to communicate with the server. So you have this one standardized, ready-made for you IRC server where all your bots can communicate to that channel and be instructed remotely in a very easy and organized way. But then you have all of these corporations started blocking IRC protocol, right? And it's very easy. You can either block it at the port number or at the semantic level of the protocol via an IDS signature or IPS signature. And then it becomes an issue for malware authors, right? Despite how easy it is to use it, but it's no longer effective to be used in the wild, since blocking it became like a standard policy for all these major corporations. So they started shifting into HTTP protocol, which becomes the standard for malware CNC communications, because it's also, at the end of the day, it blends with the normal traffic. So there isn't much difference between normal traffic and malware traffic, unless you do your reverse engineering work and to figure out what is benign and what is malicious. And HTTP, I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with it, is text-based protocol, extremely simple. Well, simple is again is a relative term. Depends on how much you read into the specification, especially when it comes to implementing the actual HTTP protocol in terms of parsing it. So that's why the focus is on HTTP and not IRC or any other protocol. This is, like I'm mentioning, what I'm about to mention next is, I know it might seem very straightforward or very obvious for some of you, but considering my experience in some teachings at some corporations or even like talking to some friends about some of this stuff, it might not be obvious for them, especially if you don't have a background in software engineering or in implementing your own protocol or coding your own TCP, UDP level type protocols, or even HTTP. So these things might seem alien to you. Again, just to mention, a protocol is never defined by its port number. It's just a port number. This is part of the standard. It's a default number. I understand some protocols other than HTTP, they might have a specific port number that you cannot change, but still, a protocol is never defined by its port number. You can change it at will, as long as both the client and the server understand it, then that's fine. It is actually the semantics and the architectural design that defines a protocol. You have to adhere to this grammar. Otherwise, it's not really the protocol that you're talking to. Now, the other misconception is when it comes to Windows, and in particular using either of the libraries, WinHTTP or WinINet. So we use these libraries for sending HTTP request to the server. That there is this misunderstanding that if I am using these libraries, this means that the generated request must be HTTP RFC standard compliant. It's not really the case, because it all depends on the implementation of how these libraries work. And the other thing is, if you're using Windows Socket WinSock library, for example, because you could send a custom TCP packet with this library, or you could construct your own HTTP request, like statically or dynamically. You can have the entire request hard-coded or dynamically fill all of the parameters in the request. In your code, you would have to set everything like by yourself, starting from the HTTP method to the HTTP version to whatever header you reference. But if you're using this library, it doesn't mean that you're not using HTTP protocol. Again, it's not the library that defines the protocol. It is the protocol semantics itself, and of course, whatever the server is expecting. And the other notes that I want to mention is that malware has full control over the client and server setup, which is fundamentally different from using a web browser. A web browser would have to be almost, depending on the company, 100% HTTP RFC compliant to communicate with different HTTP servers. Whereas for malware, no, not really. It need not be the case. Although you might see HTTP traffic on the wire generated by malware, but it need not be HTTP at the same time. And the whole purpose of that would be to camouflage the actual custom protocol that they are communicating with the server within HTTP traffic. So just because you see some HTTP elements in the traffic, it doesn't mean that it is HTTP traffic. So just keep that in mind. We'll see later on through the cases that I'll be going through. So, as I mentioned earlier, HTTP is becoming the de facto protocol for malware CNC communications. And in doing so, it happens that these authors, they committed some interesting mistakes, or I should call blunders, and be it intentional or non-intentional. And this is what makes it interesting, actually, that we don't know if it is intentional or not intentional. For example, you have specific headers in a GET request that only make sense in a POST request, like at the protocol specification level. So you might be wondering, so why would the author use such a, like, why would the author commit such a mistake? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you can clearly say that, oh, it's a blatant mistake by the author. He doesn't know what he's doing, just like lots of senior software engineers. And then you also have using wrong content length value that doesn't match the actual payload size. So what's happening here? If this is the case, and yet I'm getting a proper HTTP server response, yet the request is not valid, so you might be wondering, oh, is the server backend really HTTP server if it is really like vetting the actual request specification? So those mistakes are interesting in their own, actually, because sometimes we have malware traffic that's not easily filterable via an IDS signature, be it for potential false positive, or it might incur a lot of performance impact. So those blunders and mistakes in the request or response of the server, we might leverage them for our own advantage and write IDS, IPS signature to detect them. So in the rest of the talk, we will go through this journey of documenting such semantic and syntax level type errors. So it's not only typographical. It's not like you have you see this and written in that as that. No, you will see semantic type error as well as syntax level errors. And just before I continue, I just want to mention this, that since I'll be putting a lot of packet captures, HTTP requests in particular, I just want to mention that the value of the host header field in all of the packet decodes, I've replaced them with the value example.com, since I don't want to mention the actual domain name. And in case it's an IP address, I replace it with 10.10.10.1, unless otherwise noted. So, and also just to mention that all of the malware that I'll be talking about here, in the appendix of the paper, I have all of the MD5 hashes, as well as the malware family name reference as well. So you can look them up yourself, and they should be available on VirusTotal. So there's no secret here. You can verify everything I say here. So there's a difference of between coming up with such scenarios versus having something in the wild making such mistakes. So thus, like the proof of this work. So first, we'll start with the first case of a malware known as PKey or Adelinok. Adelinok, depends whichever way you pronounce it. In this particular case, we have the scenario where the content length value does not match the actual payload size. As you can see in the request, the content length value is 4, yet the payload size, here the payload, which is shown in hexadecimal, is actually 271 bytes. I'm not showing all the payload size because it's irrelevant. It's only the first 4 bytes, or in ASCII translates to PKey value. So how come this discrepancy? The content length has to hold the value of the payload of the post request, and yet there is no match here. So what happened? What went wrong? How did this happen in the first place? So it is such a blunder that I'm talking about. So in case you're wondering how the malware does it when it comes to calculating the size of the entire packet, this is what it does. So first, it initializes a buffer to 0, like the buffer is initialized on the heap, to a size of 431 bytes. And that buffer is set to 0 initially. So the buffer is cleared to 0. of a size 431 bytes. And keep in mind that the actual valid size of the packet is actually 164 bytes. So it's not 431 bytes as per the buffer size. It is 164 bytes only. And to calculate the size, it uses the following equation, I should say. So first, it gets the length of the URI file name. In this case, it would be length.php, followed by this hard-coded constant, which is 0x90, and then followed by the length of p key. Oh, interesting. At least in this calculation, he is accounting only for the string p key, but not when it comes to parsing the actual payload. And then it gets the length of the domain name, and here I'm translating it to the same size of the domain that is used with the malware, but it's just a fictional name. And then followed by the addition of 104 hex by y, 104, why there's your x90, I have no idea why. And then it comes to a total of 431 bytes, which is exactly the size of the buffer on the heap. But this does not match the actual size of the packet. So you might be wondering, if this is a deliberate mistake or a non-deliberate mistake? Honestly, it is a non-deliberate mistake, and this is a blatant mistake by the author, because the content length value is set to 4, and the payload honestly is supposed to hold only the value p key without the rest of the zeros. But in this case, the malware was using the WinSock library, and it uses the send API function. So in this case, no library would complain about sending such requests to the server. So yeah, this is what happened in this case. And unfortunately, at the time of when testing this request, like with the actual malicious domain, the server wasn't alive at that time to confirm this hypothesis, be it like a deliberate mistake or non-deliberate mistake. So this is one aspect of this anomaly in this request. And the other one is the missing of the user agent header field. Although it's not like an anomaly in its own, but you don't get to see that much of valid requests without the user agent field. This is just something to keep in mind when you want to mine for malicious traffic or any anomalous traffic on the network. So this is a p-key malware. Now we go into another interesting malware case, and this is quite interesting. And I'm also requesting additional insight from any of the attendees that are willing to provide in case they see it differently from what I see it. So I call it the reverse gear scenario. So first, you have a malware that's running on your infected system, right? And then it establishes TCP connection with the server. And right after establishing that connection, the malware actually sends this request that's showing in this particular slide. Yes, you might be wondering, this is a server response. It's not a request-looking packet. No, this is what it sends. The malware sends this request to the server, but this looks like it's coming from the server, right? So for you, first of all, I'm pretty sure 100% that all of you would think this is a valid HTTP request. When you look at Wireshark, I mean, there is no denying that it's a valid HTTP request, irrespective of the directionality of this request, which still doesn't make sense. But let's go with the assumption that it's a valid and whatnot. And in the request itself, you see that the server is set to SFFE, which is literally Google web server. And then the content length to 53, and then your connection set to keep alive, and then you have the actual payload. So the payload is exclusive or encrypted. And yeah, I mean, here are a couple of other interesting things to keep in mind as well. You see that there is no comma between the header field name as well as the value. For example, the content length the value 53, like usually in normal traffic, typical traffic, you would see after the column, space followed by the value. The same goes for the connection keep alive header. It is not a violation of the specification when you see such syntax, but it is anomalous. That's all there is to it. You just keep that in mind when you want to, again, mine your network traffic looking for any abnormal traffic. Of course, here you can tell that the malware is trying to blend with Google Web Server traffic. But seriously, like if this malware was running on a corporate network and what? The corporate network is using Google Web Server and this request is originating from your corporate network with SFFE server, of course, it doesn't make sense. Again, in this particular scenario, the malware was using the WS232 library, and it uses the send and receive APIs. The other thing that you need to keep in mind in this scenario is that this entire request is actually hard-coded, of course, other than the payload. The payload, again, as I mentioned, contains a unique string, which is exclusive or encrypted with the key 77. So yeah, so after sending this request, again, remember this is a request, not a response. The server responds with this request, okay? It's actually not requesting anything from the malware. Although it's a GET request, but it's not requesting anything from the malware. Again, there are lots of anomalies in this request too. A GET that comes with a payload. Of course, you would expect a payload to be associated with a POST request, not a GET request. Again, this is not a violation of the RFC, but nonetheless, how often do you see a payload associated with a GET request in a legitimate benign traffic? Almost non-existent, almost. And the other anomaly is the host header is set to the loopback address. Seriously? So you have a malware CNC server sending a GET request to the malware itself with the host header set to the loopback address. Of course, it's just fake because at the time when you establish TCP connection, you use the actual correct malicious IP address, and all of this is totally irrelevant unless you're going through a proxy or whatnot, and then this becomes an important field. In this case, again, the payload is exclusive or encrypted with the same key, and it contains sort of a magic string. The couplet length value, surprising, is actually correct. What else can I say about this one? It is missing user agent header field. But yeah, this is it for this particular request. So again, remember, this is the server response, not the malware request. And just to give you an idea as why this might be confusing, because when the malware received this request from the server, it does not parse the HTTP request, despite what Wireshark is telling you that this is HTTP. It is actually only, it's exclusive ORing the entire payload, including the header and everything, because the exclusive OR is stream-based, and exclusive OR the entire payload, it's going to end up exclusive ORing the payload of the request, and having the full decrypted magic string. And then it does a string match looking for that magic string anywhere in the payload, which is a very silly way of having to do all of that. I mean, I understand that the malware is trying to blend with the rest of the legitimate traffic, but it's still. So again, this is a clear indication that we're not dealing with HTTP traffic at all, actually. The actual malware communication protocol is in the payload of these requests, in the request and the server response. So it has nothing to do with HTTP. HTTP are used only as a camouflaging mechanism, that's all. And for the untrained eye, this might go unnoticed for sure. So in this particular case, if you decide like you wanna, like how would you detect such anomaly on the wire, right? So you might ask yourself, like, what kind of signature would I write to detect this traffic? I mean, there are lots of indicators that you can account for, but generalizing such detection is not actually that simple without incurring lots of performance impact on whatever device you use, be it Snort or any other commercial product. So you have also to account for the net flow context in this particular case. So for example, going back to this request that is going to the server, I mean, you can enforce the directionality of the request with the server being like holding the value as FFFE. And if this is going back, like going outbound from your network, then of course it stands out and you should alert on it. At least it's the minimum you should do. I'm not going to focus on the detection aspect of the actual malware payload. This is very easy. It goes without saying. So this is that for the reverse gear case. And my request for the audience is, if you have any other insight as to why the malware, why the malware author would use such reverse directionality, please let me know if you have some other creative insight. So now we go into another malware known as Proton Bot. This is also another interesting case. And the specifics of this request is the content type header that is associated with a GET request. Sorry. But how so? Usually GET requests don't have a content type. It is used to signal to the server what type of data it's being sent. So if I am posting data to the server, I am telling the server I'm posting X data with this content type. So expect this content type of the data that I'm sending. But in a GET request, what kind of content type data that I'm sending? As actually, as per the RFC, content type is used in the post or put request methods. And if it is used, if content type is used as part of the server response, it means that it is informing the agent, whoever is receiving this request, about the type of data that the server is sending. So again, it indicates the type of data that either I'm receiving or I'm sending. So if you try to load this PCAP with this particular HTTP packet, actually even Wireshark wouldn't be able to parse it correctly, and it will err on it because content type doesn't make sense in a GET request. So, so this one is actually it is a semantic type error. It is a violation and shouldn't happen in legitimate traffic. So, I mean, checking for such anomaly on your network is easy, but again, you're gonna have to keep in mind the performance impact of whatever signature you write, especially if you're doing these things in real time. So you could easily check, for example, for the presence of the content type header in any request method other than put or post. Again, you can use these performance intense signature for data mining, for example. You don't care much about performance since it's not in real time. So it's still valid to generalize your detection methods. So this is for Proton bot case. Now we'll move into another malware case. This is what I call the crosswalk case. And this one is a bit interesting, and it is based on my own interpretation of what is the likelihood, the cause of this error, and what infliction it might cause should you be attempting to parse the server response on your own. The issue with this particular case is the value of the content length header in the server response. So first, you see the malware sending this GET request with the custom header, again, custom header, DCY. This is custom header, and then there's nothing wrong with that. Remember, back in the days, custom header has to start with the characters X uppercase, that followed by dash, followed by the custom header name. This was dropped later on, and then it became that you can come up with whatever a custom header name you want. It did not follow any specific standardization other than the specifics of the other headers have to follow. So it became even more difficult to fingerprint custom headers from legitimate headers, unless you want to look for like whitelisting or blacklisting stuff. But that's also very expensive. And in the GET request, you see the content length header with a value of 0. I've seen this many times, actually. It's very surprising to see it, actually. It's just waste of space. And I mean, I'm not sending anything. There is no payload associated with the GET request. Why do I even have to use this header? There is no point of using it at all, especially if it has a value of 0. And I've seen it like in malware and legitimate applications too. So it's probably that, like for example, in the case of legitimate application, that whoever is implementing such request doesn't know what he's doing, he or she. So that's that. But here, just to mention, in the custom header, this is how the malware is exfiltrating data. It is base64 encoded, as you can tell. So after sending such request, the server responds with this response with these headers. Now, what stands out the most, of course, is the content length value. I mean, of course, it doesn't make sense at all. Like the value, this is in bytes. In megabytes, this is like about 524 megabyte. The actual payload in the server response actually is only 256 bytes. Yet the content length value is such a very huge value. So you might ask yourself, but why? How such discrepancy? Like, what happened? What went wrong here? Again, just keep in mind, going back to the library things on Windows. So the malware is not using any HTTP library, actually. It is the WinSock. And yep, it's using the WinSock library. And sorry about that. So yeah, the WinSock library. And for receiving such requests, it uses the function receive. So it's not using any HTTP library that will parse the content length header, gets the value, and then allocates a buffer on the heap with that value, and then moves the actual payload into that buffer. So the malware itself is not vulnerable to such mistake, actually. It is the malware analyst or malware researcher or whatnot, whatever you want to call it, who is vulnerable to this. Because if you're trying to automate some milking processes, like if you want to send these requests by yourself to the server and expecting something in return, like you want to milk like the server response at specific point in time, you want to automate this process or whatnot. So usually this is how you would do it, like in a standardized fashion. You would use some HTTP library or even your own parsing mechanism. You go to the content length, get the value, allocate a buffer on the heap, and then get the payload. So if you attempting to allocate such buffer like multiple times within the same process, you might run out actually of memory on your system. Now, if this is a blunder or is it an intended mistake, I don't know. I'm actually puzzled as to why this is happening. But this is something to keep in mind. And again, how would you detect such anomaly on the network? It's the same as with the other case that I talked about previously, when the content length value doesn't match the payload in the request, but here it is in the server response. So you can check for the value and you can check the payload as well and see if the length matches or not. Again, this is expensive because there is nothing unique that you're accounting for in your signature. But for data mining, this is gold. So keep that in mind. Now we go into another malware case, which is also interesting, just like the rest of the cases. And what's interesting about this one is the use of illegal characters in a given header name And in this case, it happened to be the connection header with the value close. You can see here we have the value open parentheses followed by the string null followed by the closing parentheses. So this is a violation of the RFC actually. This is not allowed. A header field name should not contain illegal characters. You might be surprising from what I'm about to say that in this particular case, when the malware sent this request to the server was running Apache version 2, and the server did respond actually with the status code 200 OK. So how come? If this header is a violation of the RFC, yet the server just happily accepted this request and responded with 200 OK. When I tested this request myself, I mean, just taking like this anomaly into consideration and sending it to the latest version of Apache, all locally, of course, not to the malware server. Actually, the server did reject this request. And I got back a 400 bad request status code. So this means that it's either a modified version on the like as a part of the malware backend server, although it's the same server like Apache, but it's a different version, or he relaxed some of the restrictions when configuring the server. Testing the same request on Nginx web server, I also get back actually, surprisingly, Nginx server does not inspect any header for such anomalies. So you could have this illegal character anywhere in any of the headers, and Nginx will still happily accept the request and not complaining at all. We'll go later on, hopefully in the next slide, I suppose, as to why this is happening, why this discrepancy between different servers. Again, detecting such requests, like in terms of generalizing the detection, might not be easy without incurring a lot of performance impact, but you can check for the presence of any illegal characters in the header field name. And you can get the list of illegal characters from the RFC specifications. Speaking of illegal characters, Socknet is not the only malware that committed such a mistake. We also have these two additional malware families known as Cobra and iTalk. In the first case, we see white spaces at the end of every line in the HTTP request, starting even from the HTTP method line, all the way to the HTTP version, followed by the rest of the headers. So you see a space character at the end of every header, or every line in the request, I should say. To send this request, the malware uses the OneSock library, and it uses the send function. So again, it's not using any particular HTTP library. Just so you know, in this case, the malware is actually exfiltrating data through the cookie. This is irrelevant to the talk, but just so you know. And at the time of testing this request, the server actually wasn't responding, so I didn't get to see what the server would respond to such request. But I doubted that the server is HTTP compliant. Probably it consists like of a custom HTTP parser or whatnot, because all it cares about is the cookie header that it would parse and get whatever exfiltrated data that it's looking for. Now, I tested the same request against Nginx with these white spaces. Again, it returned a 200 OK status code. So it happily accepted such request. Whereas in the case of Apache server, actually the server rejected it with the 400 status code. Exclusively if the white space is after the protocol version number, like on the as shown in the, on the first line. So for Apache, if you have white space character at the end of the first line, it will be rejected. So it all depends on the stringiness of the parsing of the request. In the case of ITAC, the second request, there are lots of anomalies actually. Again, you see the connection preceded with the white space illegal character. And surprisingly, again, this request was accepted by the server and didn't complain about it at all. But what is interesting is that this GET request also sends the payload, which has a value of 00 in hex, and there is no content length header associated with this request. You might be wondering why, because I have no clue why. So this could be like a blunder. It's not an intended mistake or whatever. But all of these help us into detecting this traffic, because otherwise, if it wasn't for these blunders, like there is nothing unique about the request that would allow us to detect it in a blocking fashion. And actually, a similar case was outlined by Foxit NT when it comes to the white spaces. Foxit Intel, they talked about a particular version of Cobalt Strike server known as Nano HTTPD, used in Java servers, whereby there is an extraneous space right after the status code in the server response. And that's how they managed to fingerprint all active Cobalt Strike server on the internet. So they scanned all the IPv4 addresses, and they managed to identify all of the active Cobalt Strike servers. Because of this unique abnormality in the server response, that is a space right after the HTTP status code. So this is how you could leverage such mistakes to your advantage. Now we go into another case, which is what I call the mysterious case of Cloaca. Again, this is another similar one to the white spaces one. But here, it's not at the beginning of the header field name. It is at the end of it. Now, what's interesting here is that other than that white space is an illegal character, it is the fact that you're not allowed to have a space between the header field value and the column. This is also a violation as per the RFC. So here you have even an illegal character. Actually, it doesn't matter anymore because it's an illegal character which supersedes any other violations, like in terms of order of parsing. As you can see in the host header, and you can see the other anomaly is in the accept header. There is no accept open parentheses dash encoding closing parentheses header, like as part of a custom header. Of course, this is a blatant mistake, or probably whoever wrote this malware doesn't know what he or she is doing. And yet, again, just to mention, as per the RFC, no white space is allowed between the header field name and column. Like this is verbatim copy from the RFC. It's not my own wording. And as per the RFC, sending such request, the server must reject it with a response code of 400, meaning a bad request. And why? Like, why would the RFC enforce such restriction? It is all for security purposes. And I'm not sure if you remember, like the CVE 2019-16276 in the Go HTTP library known as Net HTTP. And actually, it's a similar case, and they end up with the CVE. You can look it up and read about it. So those mistakes there could turn into some serious vulnerabilities. They look sort of how to say it, not too severe. It's just a space after the header field name, but the implications are very severe, actually, of course, depending on the context or whatnot. And another thing to note here, that Cloaca actually constructs this request manually, And it uses the socket library, so no HTTP library, to send this request. Again, surprisingly, the server accepted this request without any complaint at all. And for this particular case, the server was running Apache with PHP version 5.3.28. How did that happen? I have no clue. But again, you will see later on what could be the reason of these servers accepting these requests without any complaint. And in case you want to know why, it's all gonna come to you in the next slide. And so what would be the reason for accepting or rejecting a request that does not adhere to the specification? Like even if you are committing some serious mistakes in the request, it all goes to what's known as the robustness principle, which is clearly specified in the RFC 2145. And it says, in general, an implementation must be conservative in its sending behavior, okay? And liberal in its receiving behavior. Aha, so this explains it, technically speaking. It must be liberal in its receiving behavior. That is, it must be careful to send well-formed datagrams, but must accept any datagram that it can interpret. So it's going to keep parsing whatever it accepts, not object to technical errors where the meaning is still clear. Aha. So this EG actually clearly mentioned that as long as it's going to still accept the request as it is, this is not going to have any unintended consequences, apparently. Of course, this is implementation and interpretation dependent, whereby different HTTP servers did not behave the same way. So as you can see, this is not mathematical equation. This is English language, meaning that if I'm implementing an HTTP server myself, I could interpret the same thing differently from another person implementing the same specifications and have fun enforcing such a standard. I mean, even implementing a compiler with like C++ with a very, very strict RFC, you still end up with unintended consequences. Yet it is a compiler. So how about implementing a protocol like HTTP, which is text-based, and it's not math? So this is what could go wrong, technically speaking. It's up to the implementer. It depends on whose mood it could be. I don't know. So here we go into some more generalized mistakes, more interesting ones too. First, I talk about the many cases of malware accept header blunders. So the accept header, when you see it in a request, it's literally meant to signal to the server what content type the client is able to understand. So when I send a request to the server, be it a GET request, for example, and I have this accept with whatever value that it takes, I'm telling the server that this is the type of data I'm expecting from you. I cannot accept anything else. Of course, it depends on whatever accept value that is specifying in the request. And the accept header value has this syntax. This is not my own syntax. This is as per RFC. So first you have the mem type, followed by /, followed by the subtype. Or you have mem type, followed by /, followed by anything, so any subtype. Or you could have any mem type, followed by /, followed by any subtype. So you have these three combinations only, okay? And the mem type and the subtypes, they're already listed in these specifications. So you can have a whitelist of all the possible values that these types could take. So what I did is as simple as follows. I checked for the absence of the / in the accept header field against 2769 packet captures. They are all malicious, all malware packet captures. And what I ended up with is the identification of 18 malware families that lacks the / in the accept header. So some of them, they were empty. Like the accept header has 0 value. Others, they have the value XML, just on its own, XML. Another is you have the anything followed by dot, not / followed by dot. And one of them has a domain name in it. And one of them, nonsense value, like nonsensical, completely irrelevant value, like binary type value. That doesn't make sense at all. So I only checked for the absence of the / which has to exist as per the syntax and the specification. And I ended up identifying 18 malware families. So this means that I was able to fingerprint malicious traffic, malicious between double quotes, without looking for any unique or specific malware traffic. So this is the power of checking for any abnormalities at the protocol level, syntax/semantic level. Of course, you can generalize such detection. It did not be only the absence of the / and I'm pretty sure you will come up with different results, even better results. But this is just an example to illustrate what you could do to detect anomalous traffic on your network. Of course, we're gonna keep talking about accept headers because apparently it's one not to be missed, and malware author seems to like to make mistakes in this header a lot. I don't know why. What's so unique about it? So you have another malware. This malware is actually used in a targeted attack against some Vietnamese entities. And it arrives via the exploitation of a given vulnerability in a Microsoft Office document. The request itself is not filterable. There is nothing unique about the request as it stands from a data perspective, meaning like the payload is dynamically generated by the malware via the call of create a GUID. So just create a unique ID on the affected system and sends it out. The content length value is correct, and nothing else. The user agent value is correct. I mean, it's a standard. There's nothing unique about it. Even the URL is very benign. What stands out is the accept header, which is quite an interesting mistake. So here you see the xm.plication. There is no such value in the accept header, like it's part of the specification. So it's clearly a mistake. How did the author commit such mistake? I have no clue. They probably deleted, erased some stuff while coding this request. The actual correct value should be this one, XML followed by comma followed by application. So this is how you would detect this request. Actually, this is the only way you could detect this request. So this is another blunder. Now we go into another header, the cookie header. Its oddities and peculiarities. We must have all seen the cookie header used in so many different ways. And its use is known that it's used for tracking, session management, or customization. So every time you log in into some server, rest assured, most likely the cookie is involved. And usually it is requested by the server via the set cookie header to store whatever cookie on the client side, whether it is for tracking you, I mean, from privacy perspective, or for storing whatever data for later retrieval. And it has the following syntax. This is as per RC as well. You have cookie header name, followed by this key value pairs, followed by the semicolon, followed by space, followed by other key value pairs, and so on. You can have as many as you want. Now remember, the separation between the key value pairs is semicolon followed by space. So out of curiosity, see if any malware would deviates from such syntax. I checked for the absence of the separator equal, like that separates the key from the value. And to my surprise, after checking the same set of PCAPs as in the previous case, I ended up with the following. That is the identification of additional 13 malware families, whereby 9 of them have 0 cookie header value, nothing at all. 1 of them has spaces, and 3 of them were exfiltrating data through the cookie header. This is just by checking for the absence of the equal character. And in the same case, I checked for the pair separator, that is the semicolon, such that it's not followed by space. And in this case, I got like in my data set, I was able to fingerprint this malware family known as NuBot, which is not part of the original data set, which exfiltrate data via the cookie header actually. Now, you might say, this is not too malicious, the check for the semicolon such that it's not followed by space. It's funny, the specification clearly says this is how you should code it, and this is how you should parse it. But of course, you will get to see actually some of the same violation in the the semicolon and the next key value pairs. But nonetheless, just keep in mind in case you're mining your own network traffic. Another interesting cookie and some other header mistakes is in this malware family known as Cepnet, which is an old malware family. I don't think it's selective at all, actually. But for documentation purposes, it's still interesting to talk about it. And of course, as you can see here, what stands out the most is, again, the cookie, which literally ends with, like, holds this hexadecimal value and ends with a dot, which is interesting, a dot. Of course, I mean, this is obviously something stands out here, and you should be suspicious of this request when you see it on your network. The other observation in this request is the content length value. As you can see here, the payload is 00 without the CRLF separator, which you should have 2 as per the specification to separate the headers from the payload. But here, there is only 1. So there's another major violation. And of course, the value does not match the size of the payload. Again, we have been through this before in the other cases. This is also a clear violation. And then you have the more blatant mistake, that is the use of the max forwards header with this very large value. So the max forwards header is actually used with either of the HTTP methods, trace or options, and it not a GET request. And it is literally used for limiting the number of forwards the proxies have to carry. Of course, can you imagine this request going through a proxy? And that many number of proxies, 107,000, 1900 proxies until it reaches its destination. Of course, this value does not represent the intended meaning of, or does not hold the intended meaning of this header. It is actually a dynamically generated value by the malware, which is used for like signaling to the server that, hey, this is the port that I'll be using for listening. So this malware is telling the server that this is the port I'll be using for listening for any other coming messages when it opens another TCP channel. And of course, as you must have figured out already, this request won't be parsed correctly by Wireshark because lots of violations in this case. And again, this request was sent by the WS232 library using the send API. And it uses the receive function to receive whatever it's expecting from the server. So no HTTP library was used in this particular case. So I'm just taking a sip of water. Now we'll move into another case, what I call silencing silence, while silence is the name of the malware, which is also known as TrueBot. And this one again is, I mean, it's very obvious just by looking at the packet, like the TCP stream, and it's in ASCII format, and you can tell that the user agent value holds the value of 2 lines. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Of course, it doesn't make sense. You can see it in the hex dump as well as in the ASCII stream. You can see that 0D0A as part of the user agent header value. Now recall that for HTTP 1.1 version, the request has to at least hold the header host for it to be valid and accepted by the server. Again, it really depends on how the developer interpret the specifications and whether it allows such requests or not. But as per the specification for version 1.1, the GET request has to have at least the host header. But as you can tell here, it does not have the host header. It does exist in the request, but when you send this request and the server receives it, what it's going to see is the first line, the user agent with empty value, and then it's going to take the host and the connection header as part of the payload, and not part of the header request because of the 0D0A, 0D0A separation. So, and yet in this case, I don't know if the server accepted this request or not, because at the time of testing this request to the actual malicious server, the server wasn't alive to verify this hypothesis, but it should definitely be rejected nonetheless. And of course, loading this with a Wireshark, Wireshark would complain about it, of course, with the message, leading CRLF previous messages in the stream may have extra CRLF. This is actually not enough of an error. There are other major problem with this request. But this, you can see that malware authors sometimes sort of innovate when making such mistakes. So it's not only in the accept header, but any header. And in case you're wondering, how did they end up with this mistake? You can see it here in the slide. So, I mean, the malware uses the Windows HTTP services, the Win HTTP library for sending this request. And to initialize the Win HTTP functions and returns like an HTTP session handle, it calls this API, the Win HTTP open, which takes the value of different headers. And in this case, we can see that the user agent header is taking the double new line value. So the mistake is very obvious in the code. Looks like not only senior engineers don't code edit their code, even malware authors don't edit their code. So this one is actually, I think this is important. And it's a statistical analysis on the same set of PCAPs, the 2769 malicious / malware PCAPs, looking for different anomalies in the user agent header, and see if we can come up or identify malware that deviates from the norm, at least. So in the first case, what I did is I checked for the presence of the plus character in the user agent header value. And to my surprise, I got back 15 malware families. So all of them that use HTTP traffic, they use the plus character in the HTTP user agent. I mean, yes, you can say that it is not malicious on its own because sometimes it is substituted for space characters instead, and it's a user agent header value. You can also sort of innovate on what characters you use in this header because it's supposed to hold the name of the client that's making the request. So it's not unique in any form or shape as per the RFC. There's no whitelisting list. And I mean, this exception that I'm talking about is the you have this the malware family known as Bistafera, which uses actually the Googlebot user agent value. And as you can see, you have the leading plus character for the Google domain URL. The other test that I did is to check for the ampersand in the user agent header value. Again, I got this Allurian malware family, and you can see the value that actually holds, which looks like, or not looks like, it is actually the case that these are HTTP parameters. So you would expect to see this in the URI, not in the user agent. So this is a very easy way to identify such anomaly. And again, Danbot, which was also found by SecureWorks, also committed such very similar mistake as well, where the reference, the ampersand was found in the user agent header value. The third case is the presence of the equal character in the user agent header value. And I ended up with the identification of 8 additional malware families. And all of them happen to be exfiltrating data in the user agent header, except for one. It's still malicious, but the mistake is quite funny, which, as you can tell here, there is a repetition of the user agent header field twice, followed by equal instead of column, which is nice. So this is another way to identify this request on the network. The fourth case is checking for the backslash in the user agent. Again, I ended up with 7 malware families. So just checking for these, I mean, they need not be called illegal characters as much as non-common characters and legitimate user agent values, or at least known user agent values. I mean, of course, you can come up with your own character, or it depends on your creativity or whatever you can come up with looking for anything anomalous in these headers. So this is just an example, just to give you an idea of how you can fingerprint anomalous traffic, be it for specific malware family or any other type of malicious components on your network without having any specific signature. So such detection outlive any other malware signature because it's very generalized and it targets the syntax or the semantics of the protocol itself. I wasn't happy enough with the user agent. So I said, okay, so let me check for other HTTP headers that do not use commonly used characters. And in this case, I checked for the content disposition header. Usually this header takes either of the values: inline, attachment, form data, or name or file name. So what I did, I just checked. I parsed it correctly, and then looking for any value other than any of these RFC defined values. And again, I got this malware known as Nalodu. And as you can see here in the request, it is holding a value that doesn't make much sense, which is clearly like some sort of identifier used by the malware. So yeah. And as you can tell here again, the user agent holds computer-specific information, meaning the malware is exfiltrating data through the user agent header. These checks, they are very easy to implement, except for the fact that they are very performance intensive. But for data mining, they are very good. Now, this presentation wouldn't be complete, actually, at all, without spotting an actual corrective, what I call corrective mistake in the referrer header. As you might be familiar already, the referrer, like the word referrer in the HTTP protocol is used in the wrong fashion. I mean, it's used with one R. And if in case you are interested about the etymology of how did this end up in the HTTP RFC with the wrong word, not with the double R, please look it up on Wikipedia. But suffice to say that this ultralocker malware family used it in the correct form as per the English language, not the RFC specifications. And it used it with double R. So this is just I just wanted to mention this. Of course, you can detect this as something suspicious on your network. But interesting to see that somebody committed this mistake, actually. They are adamant that it has to be double R. It cannot be one R. So yeah. And surprisingly, just a bit of statistics here. So only 8 out of 276 malware families actually have the referrer header field in their request. I'm actually surprised because to blend with the rest of the normal traffic on your network, malware also they should actually use the referrer header, but it's sort of like legitimize even further the HTTP request. And some other interesting checks that you can do yourself as well is checking for the case sensitivity. Again, this is not a violation of the RFC, like whether the header is uppercase, lowercase, or whatnot. But in normal traffic, there is sort of like standard that everyone follows. That is, the first character is uppercase, and then what follows is lowercase. I mean, if you've looked at enough network traffic, you can clearly see it. So what I did, just to see if I can spot anything interesting in the same set of malware PCAPs, I literally checked for the case sensitivity of these list of headers, such that they are all in lowercase. So if I had to check for the Pragam, it should be Pragma, I get 6 malware families. And the same thing goes for the rest of the headers. I mean, just for cache control, all lowercase, I get 9. Now they use it. Now here, keep in mind, for the user agent, actually the libsfml library. I mean, it's a very famous library for if you want to write like it's for writing games, but it comes with the network module and the file system module and the sound module and whatnot. It actually has all of these header hard coded. I know they're all written in lowercase. So it's not just by seeing a lowercase headers, it means the traffic is suspicious. But it's just something to keep in mind, especially when you want to take this into consideration in addition to something else, and then tie all of these together and then come to a verdict whether the request is malicious or not. And yeah, I mean here, the other thing that stands out is the content disposition. I get 10. And surprisingly, just checking by the lowercase, I found a family that was actually sending control commands via the common disposition header in the request and the response. The other one, in the endeavor of checking for sensitivity in the request, that is, I checked for the get method such that it's all lowercase. And surprisingly, I get two malware family that uses it in it is lowercase format. Whereas for the post case, I got 0. It's just like statistical stuff, but it's something to keep in mind again. And the other one is I checked for the HTTP string in the request. Like when you send a GET request or any HTTP request, you have the HTTP followed by the version number, right? So I checked for it such that it's all lowercase. And funnily enough, I was able to identify this blue summer malware family. Like the rest of the request, they use standard capitalization, except for the HTTP string in the request. And the other anomaly is the use of this accept header that uses the value HS-UK, which actually is not a part of the specification. So I'm not sure from where did the author came up with this value. The other thing that you can check for is the zero spacing. Sorry, I should mention this just to show it. The zero spacing between the column and the value of the header. Again, I mean, it's not a violation, but it's just something to keep in mind. And again, like you can see here in this request, you can see like the comma. I mean, it's not that it's a violation again, but it does separate both values, but you would expect it to come right after the first value and then followed by deflate. But just something to keep in mind. It's not that hard to generalize the detection for these anomalies at all, actually. After going through the paper yourself, you can come up with whatever signatures. I talked about empty headers, like when I talk about some of those statistical analysis, but I will revisit it in the next slide, and you will see that we have the malware family known as BRICH, which used in limited targeted attacks, and it was delivered via this vulnerability. I think it's Internet Explorer vulnerability. So this is a targeted attack, so we'd expect that the threat actor is a very articulate and meticulous in terms of coding, interacting with the server, and having everything adhere to the specification or whatnot. But it's not the case actually. And surprisingly, you get to see like these empty headers, like the accept encoding header has an empty value, for example, right? Why? I don't know. It is what it is. It's just a blatant mistake. So you can easily check for that to fingerprint such anomaly on the network. Now we're done with all the cases. I'm just here. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Just some other consideration that you should keep in mind, and it's some of the stuff that I try to play with to see what other anomalies that I can identify in some of the available public source servers. For example, if you send some request against Nginx or Apache with an HTTP version other than like 0.9, 1.1, or 2, in case you're upgrading your HTTP request, actually the server does accept the request just happily. I'm not sure are you guys aware of HTTP version 8, version 15? And so I'm not sure why would they accept this request. I don't know, but it's just something like I found surprising. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind when writing these or checking for these anomalies is that you have to be port agnostic. This goes back to my pain point at the beginning of the presentation. A protocol is never defined by its port number, so should your signature. And again, as you can see, implementation is still a subjective interpretation. If I wake up one morning, I don't have my coffee, and I want to implement some feature, I'm sure it's gonna affect my own understanding of that language paragraph, like that English language paragraph. And case in point, I'm sure you must have heard of the HTTP request smuggling attacks, which actually could illustrate what could go wrong in case the developer of the HTTP specification does not clearly understand what the specification says. And you can end up with some serious implications in terms of vulnerabilities. And like the first request smuggling research was carried out in 2005 by Watchfire, and then an additional research was carried out recently by Portswigger in 2019, and they are still actually doing additional research on it. Like every now and then they come up with additional blog posts that illustrate this case. And so yeah, this is something to keep in mind, and I recommend that you read over this request smuggling reborn attack, because this is clearly a case that needs attention from everyone in the industry, actually, of how everyone interprets the specification when it comes to the implementation. That's why it seems that the English language is harder than advanced mathematics. I guess that's all. I've got nothing else to share or say, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. It was informative, or
yeah, it was really good.
Interesting. And for conclusion, as usual, I don't give conclusion. I leave it to the audience to come up with their own conclusion. And that's all from me. And thank you.
Well, thanks for you and your presentation.
Thank you.
So in the paper or anything, like do you have like a set of grammars, sort of like a compilation of your conclusion from all those like signatures that you identified from packets, you know, like I don't know, like signature for like PCAPs or like all those things? Did you manage to compile everything as like a tool or some like signature format? I'm not sure what people use for like network detection. What's the equivalent of YARA rules, you know? But I would assume there is an equivalent.
Exactly. I actually in the paper I do have all of these packet captures, and I have a conclusion, and I do mention the MD5 hashes of all of the malware that I talked about. However, I do not share the PCAPs nor any tool publicly.
Okay.
Why? I mean, the standard tool in the industry, like the open source tool, is Snort for natural detection. Like you can write your own Snort signature for detecting such anomalies. It's very easy. However, the reason why I didn't publish anything publicly is Snort is the standard one, but there are lots of other commercial vendors that have their own language different from Snort.
Yeah.
So that's why I leave it to everyone's understanding to come up with their own sort of rules and implement it in their own devices.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I didn't realize that there were like so many different formats.
Yeah.
And we got a question from the chat, which was asking, do common proxy or URL filters protect against such exfiltration?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do like common proxy or URL filters protect against such exfiltrations?
Oh, well, if the proxy is 100% adhering to the RC specification, then it might reject such request.
Mm-hmm.
So it all depends on the implementation that the proxy has.
Yeah, it may reject some stuff and may let some other stuff to pass, basically, right?
Exactly. I mean, and also you can. I mean, we all know that proxy is a very important tool, like for filtering HTTP traffic. And you can easily write signature that would check for some of these anomalies, but it really depends on the order of evaluation when it comes to the proxy receiving the request and parsing it. So I believe it is a proxy vendor specific, like when it comes to evaluating these things. So I can't generalize my answer.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. I already put your slides and the white paper you sent me on GitHub. Actually, I was just showing it on the screen now for the audience.
Awesome.
I don't think we have more questions. So, any last words to conclude?
That's all. I'll also be like publishing on my website, like the slides and the paper. And other than that, well, thanks again for the opportunity to present our opcode, and I hope everyone enjoyed it and learned something from it. That's all.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks again for coming. Take care.
You.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Hello, and we are back. So now for next presentation, we're gonna have Patrick, who's gonna talk to us about macOS ransomware that he has been looking at, and actually that should be pretty interesting. Also, there's some more stuff I want to ask him once he's done about the Apple X Protect thingy. Because he did something about it, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, or like I don't know, like at some point on Twitter. It looked quite interesting. But yeah, so whenever we should be able to start soon.
Yeah, give me 1 sec.
The future is watching. Welcome to OPCODE Virtual Summit.
Start video. Can you see me? Okay, let me just, I can stop it. Okay, I'm ready. Let me just retweet to say I'm live. Okay, awesome. You can see my screen okay and see me as well?
Yeah, we should see your screen now. Let me just share it to you. And yeah, you are live now.
All right, good evening or good morning, depending, I guess, where you're at in the world. I first want to thank Matt for inviting me to speak yet again. Definitely stoked to be talking nerdy about some really interesting Mac malware that I analyzed. So today we're going to be kind of walking through the comprehensive analysis of this malware. So we're going to talk about first its infection vector, how it got onto end users' Mac systems. We're going to talk then about how it persisted, how it installed itself so that every time the system was rebooted, it would be re-executed. And then the next part, we're going to kind of dive into some of its capabilities and show some very interesting features that this malware had that we really haven't seen in other malware specimens recently. So I'm going to dive in. If you want to follow along, I'm basically going to be walking through my blog post on the topic. It's got all the graphics and screenshots, so I figured that was kind of the easiest way to do. So feel free to also, hop on the website if you want to see that as well. The other thing is I've shared the sample of the binary of the malware itself. So if you want to, perhaps after this talk, take a closer look, you can actually download the sample, run it, in a VM, make sure you don't affect it yourself. It is live actual malware. So then you might be able to apply some of the things we talked about today. If you're more interested in, maybe trying to follow along or kind of play around with it some more, because there's still some some open questions regarding the malware. So how did we come across this malware? Well, a malware researcher named Dinesh tweeted about it. I believe he found it on VirusTotal. At the time, it was there were 0 detections, which is not too surprising for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, the engines on VirusTotal are often just the product's signature-based scanners. So a lot of security products have more comprehensive detection capabilities. They may, for example, look for certain behaviors. But on VirusTotal, it's generally just the signature-based ones. So any new malware is obviously not going to have a signature for it. So generally, that's undetected. So Dinesh was kind enough to tag me in his tweet. I was intrigued, as he mentioned initially, it looked like this was a piece of ransomware. We don't see a lot of ransomware targeting Mac OS. And I also had created in the past some products to generically detect ransomware. So I thought this was an interesting sample to dig into and also test to see if my tool was able to detect its ransomware capabilities. So next question, how does this malware get onto end users' systems? So in Dinesh's tweet, he didn't mention anything about it. However, Thomas Reed, who works at Malwarebytes, was doing some analysis and research on the malware as well. And he noted that it was spreading via pirated versions of popular macOS software on torrent sites, specifically in Russia. Now, this isn't a very sophisticated infection mechanism, but it's pretty common. So in the past, we've seen other malware abuse this technique. The idea is basically pirates or hackers or crackers more technically will take a popular application, something like Photoshop or perhaps Microsoft Office, something that is expensive and in demand. What they'll do is they'll often crack the application, bypass its copy protections so that users can use it for free, right, without a license, or perhaps they'll package it with a key generation application. But a lot of times they'll also inject some malicious code, so basically trojanizing the application. So as I mentioned, there's other malware that we've seen utilize this technique. iWorm was one. It was spread via Trojan applications on Pirate Bay. You can see on the slide, for example, things like Photoshop, Microsoft Office. This was from a few years ago. Well, actually now almost 10 years ago. So common technique. Obviously, users who downloaded and executed these pirated applications would be infected. So iWorm was one example. Another one was Schlayer. Again, we can see in the quote via BitTorrent file sharing sites, it infected was a fake Flash player update. So that was kind of interesting as well. So I take away kind of from this is, ethical reasons aside, is definitely be careful when if you are running or installing pirated software, because it's often infected with malware. And there's a great quote that kind of captures this. And, it basically says, these torrent sites often are kind of breeding grounds for malicious code as well. So, if you're a user, again, ethical reasons aside, definitely be cautious installing the pirated applications, because in this case, if you would have downloaded one of the pirated applications that EvilQuest had injected itself into, you would become infected. So the specific instance or sample we're going to be analyzing, talking about today, was in a pirated version of a popular DJ software called Mixed In Key. And again, this was available for download via these Russian torrent sites. First thing we can notice is the package is unsigned. I use a utility I wrote called What's Your Sign. Basically allows you to write or control click on any file, and then it'll very quickly tell you its code signing information via the UI. Since the package is unsigned, when you go to open it on recent versions of Mac OS, there will be a prompt from the operating system. Basically, the operating system says, hey, can't verify this, make sure or be extra careful opening this because it might contain malware. Now, if you see this pop up, doesn't necessarily mean the application has malware, but maybe again, be extra cautious. However, it's likely that Mac users who are downloading pirated software are not going to be stopped or worried by this prompt, so they're probably going to click OK, pressing onwards, which will unfortunately mean that they would then be infected via EvoQuest. So let's now kind of dive in a little deeper and start actually analyzing the package, the scripts, and the binaries to see how this malware operates. So we already mentioned it's distributed via Trojanized installers. We're going to be focusing on a disk image named mixinkey.dmg. Again, this is a Trojanized pirated version of the Mixinkey DJ software. It's kind of interesting to see them targeting users of, perhaps DJs. But again, this is just likely a popular software package that a lot of people are searching for on these torrent sites. When I did this analysis, the disk image was not flagged by any of the antivirus engines on VirusTotal. I mentioned this is not too surprising. New malware generally doesn't have signatures. The engines on VirusTotal are generally purely signature-based, so really unsurprising. I believe now, though, there are signatures for this based on the fact that this malware has now been analyzed and the AV engines have had some time to generate and test signatures for this. So the first thing I do is when I get a disk image, I mount it. And there's a few ways to do this. I use the command line, specifically the HDI util command. We execute that with the attach argument and then the path to the DMG. And this will just mount it. This will attach it onto the file system so that we can view the files within that. Obviously, we're looking to extract the content from the disk image, that DMG file, so that we can continue our analysis. So if we do that, we can see it's mounted to dev disk S3, specifically to /volumes mixed in key 8. So in terminal, we can hop over there, we can do an ls, and we can see there's a single file there called mixinkey8.pkg, standard PKG to install the application. So now we have a PKG file. PKG files are still packaged, meaning we can't just like manually start analyzing it. We need to basically extract and pull out the files from the PKG. So my favorite tool for doing that static analysis of packages or PKG is something called Suspicious Package. This is a free utility online. I believe it's created by an application developer called Mother's Ruin or something kind of unique. But if you Google this, you should be able to find it pretty easily, and the link is in the blog. So what we can now do is we can, once Suspicious Package has been installed, we can right-click on the PKG file from the DMG and click Suspicious Package. Again, this will allow us to statically analyze the files and the content of the package without running it, without installing that. So here's the UI, the interface for Suspicious Package. We can see it nicely shows all the files and where they will be installed. So we can see something called mixinkey.app and then something called patch. Interesting. We also then click on the post-install tab in the Suspicious Package UI, and this shows us the post-install script. A post-install script, as its name implies, will be automatically executed during the install, specifically right at the very end. It's a post-install script. So we can see it doing a few things. First, it's going to create a directory, library mixed in key. It's then going to move that patch binary to this library mixed in key folder to a binary called toolroomd. Then removes that util folder, sets this toolroomd binary to executable via chmod, and then finally executes this. All right, so that's interesting. We should take a peek at this patch file, which is ultimately copied to toolroomd. If we run the PKG, and you want to do this in a virtual machine because you're basically installing malware, we see there's a password prompt basically saying installer is trying to install new software. Because there's this password prompt, if the user enters their credentials, this means now the malware will have root access and can perform more malicious actions. What we can do is we can run a process monitor while we are running the installer in the virtual machine to observe the installation process, right? And we expect this to see these commands being executed when the post-install script is executed. And sure enough, we do. So we see binsh being installed. We see the post-install script being executed. It's copied into the installer sandbox directory. And we can see the path to the PKG and some other arguments. So we can capture that via the process monitor. If we run a file monitor, I use FS usage. It's a built-in utility into macOS. We can see the actions of the post install script occurring. Specifically, we can see it making the directory, that mixed in key. We can see that it then moving or renaming the patch utility to that tool room D. So this is just us passively observing, dynamically observing that post install script. And I oftentimes like to do that, right? If I see a script, I kind of read it first to get an idea of what it does, and then I'll run it in a virtual machine with some dynamic analysis tools to basically confirm that, you know, what I expect the script to do is actually good. So we could either extract this patch or this tool room D from the virtual machine, or we could actually extract it directly from suspicious package. Now, recall the suspicious package showed us that within the PKG, there was also an application called mixed in key 8. If we look at the code signing information of that, we can see it's validly signed by the application developers or by the company that creates this. This basically means it's a pristine copy of the application, you know, assuming the hackers haven't, you know, hacked that specific company, which is very unlikely. And this isn't too surprising, right? Oftentimes, when hackers are creating these Trojanized disk images of pirated applications, they will simply take the legitimate application and then package some external code. For example, as we saw here, this patch or tool room D binary. So since the mixing key is validly signed, it looks to be pristine, we don't really have to worry about analyzing it all. However, we do want to focus our attention on that tool room D binary because that's unsigned and likely is going to contain the malicious code. So the first thing we do is we run the file command. This just tells us what type of file the tool room D or the patch utility is. Again, remember patch was copied to tool room D, so they're one and the same. From the output of the file command, we can see it's a Mach-O 64-bit executable. Unsurprising, it's just a standard file format of executables on macOS. We can check the code signature. We can either use the what's your sign utility, or we can do it from the command line. If we do it from the command line, we can see that the code object is not signed. This just means that application, that binary, is unsigned. Next up, we run the strings command. There should be an S right here. I should fix that. But basically, what the strings command does is it will parse a file and extract all embedded ASCII strings. One important thing is you should always execute it with a dash command line parameter, because if you don't and you pass it a binary, it will actually only extract strings from certain sections. It won't actually scan the entire file. So this is kind of silly because we actually want to extract strings from the entire file. So again, execute it with the dash parameter. And then we pass it the path to the binary. In this case, it's that patch binary, because we want to see what strings are embedded. This is something I generally do first while I'm triaging the binary, because as we'll see, a lot of times embedded strings really give you a good sense of the capabilities of the malware or provide insight into other pieces of information that can help guide analysis further along. So what do we see here? Well, first and foremost, we see a bunch of things that look to be obfuscated strings, encrypted strings. This is interesting. If we didn't know if this sample was malicious, seeing obfuscated strings is a red flag, right? It doesn't guarantee that something is malicious, but you know, a binary with obfuscated strings is probably something you want to take a closer look at. We also see what look like some command line parameters. We see some strings that appear to be related to some keying information. Interestingly, we see a path to a binary. And if you look closely at this, this is actually swaps. And if we kind of unswap it, it unswaps to effective idiot, which is kind of interesting. That's an observation another security researcher made. And then we also have some other strings that look to be related to key presses. So interesting. So this might indicate that the malware is doing some key logging type activity, which we'll see it actually does. Next up, we hop over and we run the nm utility. The nm utility will dump the names of symbols, including function names. Again, this is another static analysis tool I run because it can show you what API functions the malware may be importing and utilizing. And based on those, again, we can get a good sense perhaps of the capabilities of the malware. So for example, we can see it using some core graphic APIs. These are Apple APIs generally associated with creating a keylogger. We also see some very interesting Objective-C APIs, for example, NSCreate object file from memory. This is very interesting because this allows a binary to create a executable memory image based on a file image. So normally when you're loading a file to execute, the dynamic loader takes a file path, loads it into memory, maps all the correct memory segments, resolves all the symbols, and then executes it. It turns out that there's an API to do that directly from an in-memory file image. So this is kind of cool. And we'll see the malware actually utilizes this to do very stealthy loading of second stage plugins or payloads. We then can also see the names of the functions that the malware has. These are the functions from the malware that the attacker has created. So based on the the function names, again, we can get some interesting insight into what it's doing. So we have some things like, TP encrypt, TP decrypt. Okay, this might be related to the ransomware capabilities. We have a bunch of React underscore function names, exec, ping, save, command start. Perhaps this is the names of the functions that handle remote tasking from the command and control server. A lot more, right? Root gainer main, loader thread, get host info, forensic send file, decode, is debugging, is virtual machine, right? Maybe some anti-analysis methods, persist executable, prevent trace. So this is really interesting because originally, we thought maybe this was just a basic piece of ransomware, but based on some of these function names, it appears that the malware may be doing more, right? So perhaps it's doing keylogging based on the utilization or the importing of the core graphic APIs. So we mentioned maybe it has the ability to do in-memory code execution because it's importing these interesting APIs. So you mentioned perhaps some anti-analysis. It has a function called is debugging and is virtual machine. This is really helpful because as we start our dynamic analysis process in a debugger, what we can do is likely set breakpoints on these functions to make sure that they're not messing up our dynamic analysis session, right? It's not going to prevent us from debugging, for example. Other strings, right? Something like get host identifier or get process list might be indicating that the malware is doing a survey for continuing. Based on the persistence names and function names, it's likely that the malware is persisting as well. And as we mentioned originally, we think this malware has some ransomware capabilities. This is likely tied to some of the functions named that have encryption in them. So we've kind of done this triage basic static analysis, right? We extracted the files, we ran the strings command, the nn command, and this gave us a decent insight into the malware. But again, it's kind of a triage. So now what we're going to do is dig in a little more and actually first disassemble and then debug this malware because we really want to gain a comprehensive understanding of its capabilities. So what we're going to now do is we're going to disassemble the patch binary or that toolroom v binary. Remember, they're just a copy of each other. And we're going to kind of start at the main function and kind of kick through and look at what the malware does when it's executed. So the first thing it does is it looks for some command line arguments. And recall we saw these in the output of the strings command. So what we can do is we can look at code in the disassembler to see what each of these command line parameters mean. So the first one is silent or dash silent. And this appears to instruct the malware to run silently. For example, suppressing the printing of error message. So for example, we can look in the code, there are various instances where if the silent parameter was specified, it sets some variable to a 1. And if that's set, it'll skip, as I mentioned, things like printing out error messages. So this is likely a debug or flag that the malware author was using perhaps during testing. Likely she or he wanted to, test the malware. And so ran it without perhaps the flag so that error messages would be displayed if the malware failed during testing. Next up, we have the no root parameter. This again is passed via the command line, and if it's specified, it sets a value to 1. Various other places within the malware then checks this flag, and if it's set to 1, it takes a different action. So for example, skipping the request for root privileges. So if the malware finds itself not running as root, what it'll do is it'll show a fake pop-up asking for credentials. That may be something the malware doesn't always want, right? Maybe it's okay not running with root privileges. So it supports the ability to execute in this kind of normal user, limited user environment as specified by the --no root parameter. Lastly, we have the ignore RP, and this basically tells the malware to ignore persistence. So again, there might be scenarios where the malware doesn't want to persist on the system. Persistence is a kind of noisy action, right? We'll talk about some tools and techniques to detect persistence. So maybe there's instances where the malware author just wants his or her malware to run once without persisting. So that can be specified by passing in the ignore RP command line option. So it's kind of interesting to see a malware be so extensible. It really kind of is starting to illustrate that this malware is rather fully functioned and fairly mature in a sense. So moving on, once the malware has parsed its command line options, it executes a function named isVirtualMachine. And if that function returns true, it exits. Now, as I mentioned, you always want to do dynamic analysis in a virtual machine because you're essentially running the malware, right? Like, don't do that on your developer machine unless you have a dedicated hardware, a dedicated system for doing malware analysis, which would be nice. I use a virtual machine largely due to it's just simple. So based on this function, though, as I mentioned, the malware will exit if it finds itself running in a virtual machine or if this function returns true. So we need to understand what this function is doing to see if we need to patch it out or modify it so that our analysis in the virtual machine can continue. So we take a closer look at this. I have the code, some disassembly, some decompilation from the malware. We can see it calls sleep with arg0. It then calls time, and then it does some checks to basically to do some basically comparison. So it actually, it calls time twice. So it first calls it right here, calls sleep, and then calls time again, and then does a comparison between this time and the sleep. And so what it's doing is it's then comparing the difference between the two calls to the time function and make sure it matches the amount of time that the system slept for. And you might be wondering why it would be doing this. And this is because it's trying to detect sandboxes, which often speed up the calls to sleep. So this is described in this quote here, talking about sleep patching sandboxes. A lot of malware, when run, will sleep for like an hour first. The sandbox obviously doesn't want to wait that long. So what it does is often patches the sleep API and basically has it return right away. So the malware is trying to detect that because in theory, if the difference between the two calls to time is different than the amount of time that was slept, this would indicate that this sleep patching is occurring. And then the malware could imply that it's running in a sandbox. So this means really this function is more of a sandbox check, not a virtual machine, right? In a pristine virtual machine, there's no hooking or modification of the sleep API. So this function will return false, which is good for us, which means we don't actually have to patch it or knock it out. So that's kind of nice. If we continue on, we can see the malware invokes a method called extract_ei. We'll talk about this more, but basically it's looking for a certain flag or magic value, dead face in hex, at the end of a binary. If that is not found, which is not in the case of the initial malware that we're executing, it skips certain persistence logging. And we'll get back to that in a second. However, if we look at this code statically, even though it's not executed, we can see it executes a method called ei_stir and passes some of those obfuscated strings we saw in the output from the strings command. This is interesting because we can now assume that, or take a closer look, because it appears that this EI_stir function is probably the malware's string decryption or string decoding function. If we dive into this a little more, we can see it calls something called EIB string key. Okay, again, this is kind of, again, we assume that this EI_stir function is the string obfuscation or decryption routine. This lends to that assumption as well. And then ultimately calls something called secure decode, which eventually calls something called decrypt. So yeah, it's likely that this is the string decryption routine. Now, generally, I don't like to spend too much time diving into the details of the deobfuscation or the decryption algorithm because we can often simply avoid having to spend a lot of time understanding this. Because as we see, we can normally just set a debugging breakpoint after the call to this function and dump out the string that was decrypted. So this basically allows the malware to decrypt or deobfuscate the string for us, right? Instead of us having to statically analyze the decryption algorithm. Because especially if it's some custom crypto, that may take a lot of time. But we can at least dump the encryption key, which we see as this value right here. So I mentioned what I normally do is simply set a breakpoint after a call to the function. So if we scroll back a little bit, what we do in a debugger is we would set a breakpoint. Oops, did I go too far? For example, right here, or actually right after here. And then we could just dump this var 50, which would be the now decoded or decrypted string. So again, it means we don't have to worry about how the malware is actually decrypting or decoding its string. In a debugger, we can just dump when it's decrypted. Now, a downside to this is we'll only decrypt strings when the malware invokes this function and our debugger breakpoint is hit. So this means if an encrypted string is only referenced in blocks of code that aren't executed, we won't ever see that decrypted value. And of course, we want to decrypt all the strings. So we know that the malware can decrypt strings, right? It calls this EI_stir function. So we just need a way to convince the malware to invoke this function on all the embedded strings. Turns out it's really not too hard. What we can do is we can create an injectable dynamic library that resolves the address of this EI_stir function. And then we simply invoke this function on all the encrypted strings. And luckily, all the encrypted strings are kind of in the same segment of the binary. So that's exactly what we do. So here's the code for that injectable dynamic library, whose goal is to decrypt all the embedded strings. So as I mentioned, the first thing we do is we resolve the function address of the EI_stir. Again, recall this is the decryption function that the malware uses to decrypt its strings. And then once we have that, we initialize some pointers. We are basically pointing to the start of the C string segment, which is where the embedded strings exist. So once we have those, we now have a pointer to all the encrypted strings in the malware's binary or in memory. And we just iterate through the entire C string segment that is, some amount long. I just hard-coded this because I'm kind of lazy. And we call this EI_stir function pointer on every single one. So if we execute this, we use the DYLD insert libraries to our decryptor library and execute the malware. This will cause our dynamic decryptor library to be loaded into the malware's address space. It will resolve the address of the malware's decryption routine and invoke it on all encrypted strings, dumping it to standard out. So we can see now there's a very large list of very interesting decrypted strings. And these are interesting because the malware in general, will encrypt or obfuscate sensitive strings. For example, command and control servers, because they don't want malware analysts to be able to access this information easily. So decrypting all these strings, again, gives us a lot of really interesting insight into the malware's capabilities. So we can see, for example, an address of a command and control server. We can see some references to files. We can see some commands to launch executables. We can see a bunch of regexes to file patterns that appear to match certificates, private keys, and cryptocurrency, perhaps keys and wallets. We have some more strings related to the run-in memory that we suspect the malware supports. an embedded property list, which is likely due to persistence, maybe names of the malware where it's going to persist. So in short, a lot of really interesting things. Embedded command and control server, perhaps the name of the malware, security tools that the malware may look for, and then something that appears to be the ransomware message. So, and finally, file extensions that perhaps the malware is going to ransom. So simply from these decrypted output, we now have an even better understanding of the malware's likely capability. And this also allows us to now further our static and dynamic analysis, because what we can do is we also have the addresses of these decrypted strings that we can reference in, for example, disassembler and see where the code is referencing that. So for example, if we're interested where the ransomware routine is, we would go look at where this ransomware message is displayed, and we'd look for a cross-reference in the static analysis in the disassembler, and this would then be within the function, or at least the chunk of code that was responsible for alerting the user that their files have been ransomed. So this will give us a good spot to analyze, because a lot of times malware binaries can be very big, and it's very helpful to know where you want to kind of begin your analysis. So now we have the ability to decrypt all the strings. This gives us kind of a leg up. I do want to point out that another security researcher named Scott created a Python script that is actually capable of decrypting the strings manually. So he actually went through and reversed the entire decryption algorithm, extracted the keys. So very impressive work. I'm not as, let's say, committed as Scott. I'm just kind of lazy. I'd rather have the malware do this. But this is another approach, and definitely kudos to Scott. All right, so now we have all these strings decrypted. We can now continue our static analysis. We see the malware invokes a function named persistence main, which persists the malware. However, before this function performs the persistence, it invokes various anti-debugging logic in an attempt to thwart dynamic debugging. This is fairly common. A lot of malware does this. It tries to detect if it's running in a debugger session with the assumption, the correct assumption, that if it finds itself running in a debug session, it's likely being debugged and thus analyzed by a malware analyst such as Patrick. So it should, exit or try to prevent that. This is pretty easy to track down. In this malware, it has a function named isDebugging, so we can very easily go and see how it's doing its debugger check. And this is implemented at address 7AA0. If we look at the code, we see it invoking a system API, syscontrol, with these parameters, kernproc and getPID. And this basically asks the system for information about the process. And since the malware calls it with getPID, it's going to provide information about itself. When it returns, this API provides a bunch of structures that are now populated with information about the running process, including a info struct that has something called kppro. And there will be a flag there set to ptrace if the malware is, or if the process is being debugged. This is a common check. As I mentioned, a lot of malware does this. So I had a slide from previous malware analysis. We can see this is what it looks like in assembly code, and then this is how it looks like in pseudocode. Again, here's the call to that syscontrol call, and when that returns, the malware will check if the ptrace flag is set on the process. So if the malware detects that it's running in a debugger, we can see right here it calls exit. So we need a way to subvert this logic, because obviously we want to keep debugging. We want to keep dynamically analyzing this sample. The easiest way to do that is simply set a breakpoint on this instruction right here, which is the comparison of the function call return, and basically change the value so that this jump instruction is taken and so the malware doesn't exit. So it's pretty easy to do. In the debugger, we set a breakpoint immediately after the isDebugging function. That breakpoint is hit, we can dump the return value from the function. We can see, yes, indeed, RAX is set to 1. RAX will contain the return value from the function. 1 meaning true in this scenario, meaning the malware has detected that it's running in a debug session, which is unsurprising because we are debugging it. What we then do is we execute the regwrite debugger command, and we set the register to 0. This is basically saying, no, we're not debugging. We then allow the malware to continue, which means this comparison will hold, and this, or rather will not hold, and this jump zero command will be executed. So what we've done is we've just kind of subverted the malware to skip the check to see if it's in the debugger, which allows us to keep debugging. Unfortunately, the malware then contains more anti-debugging logic. It has a function named prevent trace, and this seeks to prevent tracing or debugging by calling ptrace with deny, ptrace deny attached. We can see that in the disassembly of the prevent trace function within the malware. This is another common anti-debugging technique that a lot of malware will implement. So if you're looking at Mac malware, you're likely to encounter that. Ptrace is obviously a system call. The ptrace deny attached is an Apple-specific flag or parameter that basically tells the system to disallow processes from being able to attach if the process is already running, or if the process is already running and a debugger is attached, it will automatically execute. So we don't want this code to run because it will essentially kill our debugging session. So the easiest way to do that is simply set a breakpoint on the call to the function, the code that invokes the prevent ptrace. And we can do that right here. You can see here's the call. This 7C0 is the call to the prevent ptrace function. And then what we do is we use the read-write command, and instead of modifying the RAX register, we actually modify the instruction pointer, which changes the instruction that's about to be executed. Instead of calling the prevent trace, it'll just call the very next instruction. So this allows us to basically skip over the entire function call altogether. So now we can continue our dynamic analysis, unperturbed. The next thing the malware does is invoke a method called kill_unwanted. And what this does is it gets a list of the running processes, iterates through all of them looking for common security tools. For example, Little Snitch, Kaspersky, Bitdefender, something called McAfee with 2 Fs. And if it finds processes that match that, it will invoke the kill API to execute, to kill these processes. This is just a mechanism to probably prevent detection or persistence. So kind of interesting to see malware taking kind of offensive capabilities against installed and running security processes. All right, so now the malware has done all that, it finally calls the persistence logic. And what we can do is we can dump some of the values. These are decrypted strings, and we can see these are the paths likely related to the persistence. Kind of jam through the specifics of the persistence, but basically if we run a dynamic analysis tool like a file monitor, we can see it creating files. For example, something called com.apple.questd or tilde library com.apple.questd. And if we MD5 these, we can see that these are both the same copy of the same binary, which again is this tool D binary. It's a malware basically making itself. So the malware makes 2 copies of itself in the library and the tilde library directory. Once the malware has made a copy of itself, it'll persist itself as a launch item. And we can kind of pop through the code and debug some strings. If we jam down a little further, we can see it decrypting an embedded property list file. And once it writes it out to the file system, we can examine it fully. And we can see that the property list it's created is something called com.apple.questd.plist. In this case, it's in the user's launch agents directory. And since this property list has the run at load key set to true, this tells the operating system every time the user logs in, please execute whatever is specified in the program arguments key, which is the path of yet another copy of the malware, com.apple.questd. And note that it also passes in the silent flag. So in other words, this is the malware persisting as a launch agent. One of my tools, BlockBlock, monitors for persistence, so we'll detect when the malware goes to persist. Basically monitors for the creation of new launch agents. Interestingly, if the malware is running with root privileges, it invokes a method called install daemon, and this time it persists as a launch daemon. So it actually creates another property list with the same name, but in the launch daemons directory. So this basically means the malware has persisted twice if it's running as root. It then, interestingly, or rather unsurprisingly, launches these launch agents. So these launch items are running. If it's root, there's going to be two copies, the launch agent and the launch daemon. And then it makes yet another copy of itself via a call to create rescue executable. This is just another copy of the malware that will be running kind of in the background. And it's interesting because this is just another way that the malware kind of ensures that if you, for example, kill the main malware process, it can detect that and basically make another copy of itself. And here we can see the malware via a process monitor launching that additional copy of the malware, which is in the user's library directory, and it's a randomly named binary. So this kind of wraps up the first part of our analysis. We basically saw its infection vector, which was Trojanized pirated applications. Talked about its persistence, right? Launch agent, it's running as root, logging daemon as well. Then we also talked about some of its anti-analysis logging. So now we're going to dive in and we're going to continue and look at actually what the malware does once the system has been infected and persisted. So the first thing that it does is very interesting, is it actually infects other binaries on the system. So in other words, it has the ability to execute viral infection. And to me, this is really interesting because as far as I'm aware, this is the only, at least in recent memory, Mac malware that has viral capabilities. Normally when malware gets on the system, it creates a launch agent, a launch daemon, and calls it a day. It doesn't actually modify other binaries on the system. Interestingly, the malware does this by spawning off a thread and invoking a method named loader main. What this does is it first calls a method get targets, which gets a list of executables, and then it calls something called append EI. And we'll talk about these functions in a little more detail. So first, the get target function is executed. It's given a root directory to start with, /users. And what it does is it recursively generates a list of files. For each file that is encountered, it invokes a callback or filter function called isExecutable to see if the file is of interest. That is it a target that the malware can virally infect? If we look at the isExecutable function, it first checks if the path contains .app. And if not, it continues onward and checks if the binary has one of the 4 magic headers, magic values that indicate I believe, a universal binary or a mock-O binary. So this is basically the malware checking if the file is a target for infection based on its file header, right? Is it basically a mock-O file? It then calls the append EI function, and this is the actual viral infection function. So now the malware has identified targets of interest, binaries on your system, on the infected system. What it will do is it will open and read the contents of the source and the target files. The source is the malware, the target is the file it's about to infect. It then writes the content of the source file, which is the malware, to the start of the target. So it puts the virus, the malware, at the beginning of this code. It then rewrites the original code of the target program immediately after that. And then it appends a trailer, an infection marker called deadface. Recall in the first part of this talk, we mentioned that the malware checks for this. The original version of the malware didn't have this because it's a pristine copy of the malware. But any binary that is infected will have this trailer at the end, so that check would then hit. So once an executable file is infected, since the malware has inserted itself at the beginning, the malware's code will actually run first whenever the binary is executed by the system or by the user. Of course, the malware wants to ensure that nothing is amiss, so it should run the original code as well, right? If you've double-clicked a binary on the desktop that, plays some music, you expect music to play, right? it didn't, you might suspect something is amiss. So what the malware does is it detects that it's running in an infected file, goes and finds the content of the infected, the original file, which has been kind of put at the end of the file, writes that out to a new file called dot, and then the original file name 1, and then sets that to executable and executes that. So we can see that I created a file called infect.me on the desktop. I ran the malware then went to infect that. When I then went to manually run the infect.me binary, which has now been infected, we can see via a process monitor that behind the scenes, the malware has created a restored copy of the original binary called infect.me1 with a dot, and then executes that. It's kind of interesting. So since we understand this viral routine, this means two things. First and foremost, it means that simply removing the malware's launch agents and launch daemon will not disinfect a system, right? And that's why viruses infect systems, to make it very difficult to disinfect. So this is interesting. Again, this isn't something we normally see Mac malware do. Basically, this means if your system is infected, it's like, burn it down, right? I mean, it's going to be very difficult to disinfect it. However, we could write a disinfector. We could simply scan for this dead face marker and then basically parse the trailer, which has the offset to the original code, and then basically rewrite or restore the original file ourselves. So it would be possible to programmatically disinfect the system if we were so inclined. But really, if a system is infected with EvilX, it should just be wiped and macOS should be restored. So that's the viral infection capabilities of the malware. Very interesting. Next, we hit file exfiltration. So a neat capability of this virus is its stealthy exfiltration of files that match certain regular expressions. So the malware spawns a thread called forensics thread, which connects to the command and control server, and reads a file that contained the address of the malware's remote command and control server. It then generates a directory listing. We can see in a debugger when I run it on my VM, it's all the user's directory. The directory listing is then uploaded to the attacker's command and control server. So the attacker now has a full directory listing of your files on the system. And it does this via the forensics send file function. The malware then invokes the get targets function, which we discussed earlier. However, this time it passes another callback, which is called isLFSC target. And what this simply does is for every file on the system applies a regex to see if it matches to one of these decrypted regex that we saw earlier in our decrypted string output are related to certificates, private keys, and cryptocurrency related files. Key.pdf, wallet.jpg, etc., etc. So this means the malware is basically sniffing the system for private keys, certificates, and cryptocurrency keys and wallets. So we can see that once the a file matching one of these regexes are found, it will call again this forensics send file to exfiltrate that specific file to the attacker's command and control server. And we can confirm this in the debugger. I created a file in my virtual machine named key.png, which would match one of those regexes. And sure enough, we can see that the malware found that file and then it's going to send that to the command and control server. So this just validates and confirms, yes, indeed, the malware is scanning the system and exfiltrating files that match those regular expressions. So again, if you're infected, you have to assume that the malware has all your private keys, wallets, and cryptocurrency keying information, if those are stored on your Mac. Next up, the malware also spawns a thread to do some persistence monitoring. This is interesting because it appears that the malware is doing some basic self-defense via KQs. I'm not going to go through kind of all the details of this implementation, but basically it tells the system it's interested in watching itself, and if itself is deleted or removed, as long as it's still running in memory, it will get a notification because it's registered for a watch on itself, and will go and repersist itself. So this is interesting. We can observe this passively in a virtual machine that's been infected, we remove the main malware binary. This is the one that's persisted and referenced in the launch items, either the launch agent or the launch daemon. We do an ls command to confirm that the file has been deleted. If we then spin up a process monitor, we can see that the tool roomd binary, which is the instance of the malware that's also running, detects that the file was deleted and writes it out again. So again, if we do an ls, we can see the malware has repersisted. This is very interesting, right? This is basically, again, showing that this malware is decently sophisticated and mature, that it's actually watching itself and has some self-defense capabilities built in. So if anyone removes it, the malware can repersist itself. It's very, very sticky. Next up, we have remote tasking. So the malware also supports the ability to execute a small set of powerful commands remotely that really give the remote attacker the ability to fully command and control an infected system. So what the malware does is spawns off a thread, connecting with the command and control server, gets the address of that. If the primary command and control server or this address is down, it uses a hard-coded IP address, 167, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It then invokes the get host info function, which basically generates a survey about the infected system. We can see it contains the username and information about the system. For example, the version of the operating system, et cetera, et cetera. The survey information is serialized and then sent to the attacker's command and control server. If we look at the malware's disassembly, we can see that the response from the command and control server is something called check command. Cool. Interestingly, it appears that there is some information, perhaps a checksum in this response, that is logged to a hidden file, .shcsh, which perhaps means this is a good indicator of compromise and may have some other information about what commands were executed. So any tasking that's received as a response from the command and control server is handled via a function named dispatch. What this basically does is checks first it checks that some checksum matches, and then actually checks if the command is if the command that was sent to the host is specific for the host or not. And it does this by first checking if the response from the server offset 10 contains hex 200. It also then checks that at offsets, another offset is some other hard-coded value. And most interestingly, at offset 14, it checks that the first byte of the infected system's MAC address is not 0. It checks if it matches what's in the response from the server or if it's not 0. So that's kind of interesting. So that MAC address check is kind of the most interesting one because this means that the attacker either knows the first byte of the infected system's MAC address, because nowhere in the code is the MAC address actually sent to the server. So it means the attacker has some a priori knowledge of the systems he or she is targeting, which is kind of interesting. Or it could also mean that the attacker only wants commands to be processed on an infected system where the first byte of the MAC address is 0. I don't know what that means in the sense, I don't know what systems have a MAC address at 0, but it was 0 on my VM, but not on my base system. So there's some interesting things there. I don't fully have a good answer yet for that, but the fact that the malware is checking the MAC address and seeing if the command kind of matches that is interesting. Again, especially since no information about the MAC address is actually sent to the attacker, for example, in the initial survey. So that's interesting. And it does that via the check if targeted function. So again, are certain systems targeted? Who knows? All right, so now let's look at what tasking or what commands are allowed, what are supported. So first off, there's something called react exec. And this contains the logic to execute data received from the server in memory. So this goes back to the APIs we mentioned earlier, NS create file image from memory, et cetera, which allow the system to take a file image in memory and convert it to a executable in-memory image that can then be run. So I talked about this at a talk at Black Hat a few years ago. Apple actually used to have sample code. They don't have this online anymore, but if you Google memory-based bundle, and this is a very stealthy technique because it means that malware can, for example, pass down an encrypted payload from a command and control server, decrypt it in memory, and then directly execute it in memory using Apple APIs, right? It doesn't have to do all the in-memory loading and symbol resolving itself. So very, very stealthy and kind of an advanced capability to see. The React save command decodes data received from the server, saves it to a file. Pretty basic. The React start is just a no-op, not implemented. The React key command, which is a value OX8, starts a keylogger. We talked about seeing some keylogger related strings in the strings output and the NM output. So this is where these API and keylogging specific functions come into play. So specifically, the malware will invoke the core graphic CG event tap enable, which will start something called an event tap. It's just basically how you do keylogging on Mac OS. The interesting thing is, though, in the callback routine that is invoked in the malware every time a key press is pressed by the user, it's just printed out. There's just a call to printf. So it's not like written to a file or sent back to the attacker's command and control server. So perhaps this part of the malware is not quite done yet. The React ping function basically just compares a value from the server and responds back with hi there. So it's basically just a ping pong kind of thing. One very interesting piece of information about this method is in subsequent versions, the ping string has been updated to instead say hi Patrick. So it seems that the malware author was paying attention to my analysis and gave me a shout out. So that definitely made me smile. So, wherever the malware author is, mahalo for reading my blog and giving me a shout out. That was always, one of my goals as a malware analyst, see my name in some malware. Moving on, the host command is a no-op, doesn't do anything. And then finally, we have the React S command, which simply executes a command from the server. So we can see the malware supports this kind of basic command and control tasking, the ability to execute in-memory payloads, kick off the keylogger, download a file, execute a command. This really gives the remote attacker complete access to an infected system. And then finally, we have the ransom capabilities. Basically, what the malware does is it enumerates all the files on the system, starting at the users directory. And for any file that matches one of these 20, 30 or so file extensions, it will ransom them. Not going to go through all the details of the ransom utility, the ransomware routine, but basically it calls a function isCarve to check if it's already been ransomed. If it hasn't, it goes ahead and encrypts the file via a call to EIP encrypt. It then shows this message to the user, or rather saves this to the desktop. It also pops up this modal window and reads this. It's kind of creepy, your VM starts talking to you, that basically says your files are encrypted. As I mentioned, I wrote a utility that generically looks for the rapid creation of encrypted files by untrusted processes. And this tool thus can generically detect when the ransomware starts. Basically, it can detect and alert you when one or two files are encrypted. It will suspend the process and basically say, hey, just to let you know, something is encrypting all your files on your system. And then you can either allow it or terminate it. Now, we might be wondering about file decryption. Interestingly, there is a function named uncarve target, which appears to be able to unransom a file if you give it a file and the decryption key. However, there's no cross references to that function. Meaning nowhere in the code is this function referenced, right? It's not like the attacker can send the command then to execute that. So that kind of also is interesting. Also, it doesn't appear that the encryption key is sent to the server. So it really seems like the attacker has no intent of actually decrypting the file. Some researchers at SentinelOne, though, analyzed the encryption routine, and they found out that it used some custom crypto, but basically did use a symmetrical encryption key that they were able to ascertain. And so they published a decryptor for that. So good news if your files are encrypted. I would recommend not paying the ransom because it doesn't appear to actually decrypt that. And it's interesting because in the README now, it basically says make a payment to this Bitcoin address. It doesn't give you an address or any other way of communicating with the attacker. And as I mentioned, there's no cross-reference to the decryption routine. So it really doesn't seem the attacker is going to go ahead and decrypt your files for you. So, but luckily, as I mentioned, the SentinelOne researchers released a decryption utility. So it's interesting, right? There's some discussion is, why is this malware even ransoming files? Is this a cover? Is it a wiper? And that's a really good question because as we saw, it has the ability to, do things like execute in-memory payloads, and it has tasking that's looking for specific MAC addresses, which would indicate it's very, very targeted. My guess is that the attackers are probably trying to infect as many users as possible. And certain targets that are of interest, they're not going to trigger the ransomware logic. Other targets, though, that are perhaps to hide the malware or make some money, they said, hey, screw it. This target really isn't of interest. We might as well go ahead and ransom all the files, and maybe we'll get some Bitcoin out of it all. Whereas targets that are of interest, they probably don't encrypt the files and instead just keep using that command and control server to maintain covert or surreptitious access to those infected files. So that wraps up kind of a whirlwind tour of EvilQuest. We kind of thought it was just ransomware at the time, but digging into it more, we really saw it had some file exfiltration capabilities, remote tasking capabilities, and yes, ransomware logic. As I mentioned, some of the free tools I create, Block, and ransomware can detect and thwart this attack, and did so with no a priori knowledge, which is kind of neat. Finally, we have some indicators of compromise. These are kind of the files to look for on a system if you think you might be infected. But I do want to reiterate, if you are infected, that means the viral logic has also executed, which likely means other binaries on the system have been infected with the malware. So best bet is to simply wipe the system and fully reinstall macOS. So that's a wrap. Thank you again to Matt for organizing this conference, and thank you all for listening in. I think we have some time for some questions if there's any questions to be had.
Thanks to you for joining again. When you mentioned the SentinelOne tool, I just got lost and I started to Google it and to have a look at it. Do you know how it works? Is it because the encryption of the file was weak, or because it seems like there's this assembly file where they're just hard coding a bunch of function TDP crypt, iscarve, I'm not sure if they actually really wrote some function, if it's just copy paste of some hard coded functions and then they can just decrypt them.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't dug into it that close. I did briefly look at the encryption logic, and it did seem to appear to be generating some random keys. It was calling time, SRAN, and stuff like that. So I was surprised when they were able to figure out a decryption routine generically, because I thought the key was randomly generated, and as I mentioned, not
machine specific or something, right?
Yeah, so I don't know the details of that. They promised to open source it. I'm not sure if it's open source.
It is open source actually. They published
awesome.
it 8 days ago. I'm checking the source now. It's a guy called Julien-Pierre Evorus who worked on it apparently.
Another French guy.
I think so. I'm checking his GitHub. He's from Paris. Yeah. I'm telling you, like French people, they spend like all of us spend our time like cracking software when we were teenagers. So
Yeah. So I kind of looked at it and I was like, this looks too hard. And I think it took them like a week of like super, nerdy reversing it. So like mad kudos like that. I was very impressed. It's not something I was going to do. So.
Yeah, but that's why I'm do you know if they wrote a blog post to give a bit more detail about the encryption also?
I didn't see one. I mean, they published a blog post kind of on their technical analysis, kind of looking at the new versions. The new version really didn't change much. I mean, it added a shout out to me, which I thought was neat, but the functionality kind of stayed the same. But no, it would be very interesting. Hopefully there's one forthcoming, because I would be very interested, because a lot of the crypto routines are pretty extensive, right? It's not like a basic XOR. So either there's some custom crypto or some a standard encryption algorithm with, modified constants or something. So, and maybe that's where the weakness was introduced. But yeah, it would be very interesting to dive into that deeper.
Yeah, it's kind of cool every time like some people manage to write a tool, to recover files. It's like you're like, oh, so because the question is like for ransomware is like either you do it on purpose to make it weak, for like XYZ reason, or I don't know, you're just really dumb, because there's already like models of stuff, like how can you like but I guess it does make sense anyway to not make it like bulletproof, because at least if people can still recover, maybe if you get arrested, it plays in your favor, because otherwise it's probably like you were saying, like, is it a wiper or not? And then if it goes into wiper, it's like pure destruction. And I think that's if you ever get arrested, you probably get. I mean, even if you get arrested and files can be recovered, you're probably gonna get destroyed. But
Sure.
I think it's
it is interesting.
Yeah. I'm very curious about it. Like
because this malware author.
Is it one guy or is it like some stuff that had been shared across multiple teams?
No, it's the first time I've seen it. So that was the interesting thing. A lot of Mac malware we see uses a lot of kind of shared code, or it's like not written that well, right? It's got like a lot of like Linux APIs instead of like, the Mac specific stuff. So this malware author though is intimately familiar with, coding Mac on the Mac. And, it's a very comprehensive and well-written piece of Mac malware. So yeah, it's very, it's doing in-memory code execution using KQs to monitor files. Like, this is a very competent Mac malware author. So the fact that the ransomware piece is kind of subpar is very interesting, because as you mentioned, it defeats the purpose if you're using a symmetric key. And by now, I would imagine that ransomware authors, have, it's not that hard to correctly ransom files, right? Using like public key exchanger or whatever, a random key that's sent to the attacker. So yeah, it either seemed that this ransomware logic was a distraction or just not really that thought through, because also the
guy left the symbols also, right?
Yeah, the symbols were in there, and also the payment was like
I was like, what the hell?
US for ransomware decryption, which is really low. So yeah, it's interesting. So
nice. I mean, like, why not? If you have like your symbols, I don't think it's not preventing the ransomware to work.
Yeah,
but I thought it was quite funny actually, because when you showed it at the beginning, I was like, oh, is it like, do they share like symbols for like ransomwares now? I was like,
it made analysis far easier. It's like, having a function named is debugging or like encrypt files.
Yeah.
So that was nice. So, maybe then this malware is maybe a work in progress, right? We saw the keylogger logic not be complete.
That's very possible. I mean, also once you get in that business, usually you don't stop at one,
yeah. I don't. The other thing about the ransomware is, I think someone checked that Bitcoin address and it showed that 0 people had paid. So that either means it was wildly unsuccessful, or again, it was just kind of a cover or a wiper, and the ransomware, the malware author actually never really expected that to make any money. So
is it quite common to see ransomware on macOS now?
No, this is only I would say the third real sample. We had Key Ranger, I believe in 2016, which was, a fully functional ransomware. But again, its goal was simply ransomware. We had another one called Mac Ransom a few years later, again, just doing ransomware. So over the last few years, we really haven't seen it, which is interesting. So that was kind of the interest when I saw this to really dive into it. It was just like, hey, this is not something we see every day. And as I started digging into it more, I was like, wait a minute, this is not just some basic ransomware. It's really got a lot of very advanced capabilities. And the ransomware piece is either an afterthought or a cover, which is interesting. But it does, encrypt files, so it is ransomware.
Yeah, it does the job. So I mean, most of even on Windows, most of ransomware are like not really advanced. It's usually very redundant. And then it takes like a few years for EDRs to say like, oh, we're blocking against ransomware because the thing is encrypting like more than 1,000 files. It's like,
and that's why the ransomware utility I wrote, I think it was in 2015. It was like, I was like, does this tool still work? Because it really hadn't had a lot of ransomware to test it, but Mac Ransom is pretty basic. So luckily those generic heuristics still work 5 years later. But yeah, the other thing was the in-memory code execution. And I know memory forensics is a very interesting topic that's near and dear to you. This is an example where, as you mentioned, kind of an EDR product or security tool will have no insight into what the malware is basically downloading and executing, unless you have a kernel extension, which Apple is deprecating. So it is unfortunate that Apple is kind of doesn't really provide an easy way for security tools to examine memory of remote processes, and attackers know that, and it does seem like they are kind of taking advantage of that by this is the second piece of malware this year we've seen leveraging that in-memory code execution specifically as a way to be incredibly stealthy and bypass the abilities of security tools.
That's really a shame. So there is no alternative, huh? So there is no kernel extension, and the APIs that they're giving for like monitoring are like very high level, right?
Yeah. So via kernel extension, I'm sure you could still do that, but those are basically deprecated and going away. So I'm surprised they're even supported at all in macOS 11 that's coming out. But yeah, unfortunately, the endpoint security framework, my understanding is it doesn't have, doesn't provide the opportunity to do that. I'm guessing what Apple is going to do is very shortly, especially on their new ARM platforms, is disallow in-memory execution. So they're probably like, hey, you guys, security tools don't need this capability because it's something we're disallowing shortly anyways.
I mean the ARM stuff I think is gonna take a while because there's still a lot of like non-ARM stuff which is gonna work. Because when I did my Windows exploit for ARM64, I mean it pretty much worked exactly the same way as you would do on x64. There's just some like minor differences, but it's not like crazy like different that you're like, oh wow, like that's nothing works, like even like for like a page table translation it was still the same thing,
That's awesome.
So it's
make
your
exploit writing easier.
I mean, like I didn't know anything about ARM64, and I wrote everything in 2 weeks. I took that SMB Ghost exploit, right, and I wrote an ARM64 version.
That's badass.
I presented it at the last Opcode actually.
Nice.
And and that was not that not that different. So I would expect probably something similar on Mac. I know on Windows because of the what do they call it? The HVCI, like hypervisor code integrity, which is enabled by default now on on Windows, so including on ARM. On the ARM version I had, it was not enabled by default because it was in a updated Windows, but now it is by default. So unless they do some like secure virtual memory type of thing like there is on Windows now on OS X, I guess they're still gonna have a bunch of problems. But yeah. And by the way, I wanted to ask you also your tweet about the X-Protect, because I didn't know what X-Protect was.
Sure.
And so if I understood correctly, so you got the signature from the Apple database, right? So X-Protect, I guess, is the Apple antivirus?
Yeah, exactly. It's not something Apple really likes to talk about because it, brings awareness to the fact that Macs get malware, which Apple doesn't really like to talk about. But yeah, basically, in every version of Mac OS, there is XProtect, which is a signature-based AD. They have recently started using Yara, which is kind of interesting. And so what they do is every now and again they
the Yara signature that you posted in your Twitter screenshot is directly from XProtect?
Yes.
Oh wow! I thought you had to like reverse the database and do like a Yara.
No, they just.
Oh wow!
There's like a xprotect.yara file that you can just grab. So in the context of EvilQuest, they pushed out one signature and then a week or two later updated it because there was a new variant and their initial signature wasn't that good of a Yara signature. And then the other tweet I had about it is the problem is when they push out a signature, they never say what it is. So the most recent one, right, they just name it Mac something, something, something. We can extract the Yara signature to see what they're looking for, but they don't share information about the binary or the file, which to me is a little unfortunate because it would be great if, they were well, I'm not going to go on this rant right now, but it would be nice if they shared, more information about the malware they were seeing and perhaps shared a hash or binary, because the latest XProtect update contains a new signature for a compiled AppleScript malware. And so we can see what the signature is looking for, but nobody has any other information about this file, right? It's not on VirusTotal. None of the security researchers or AV companies I've talked to know about it. So, Apple has this information. It would be great if they shared it with other security researchers. But for now, we're basically stuck, monitoring XProtect's signature database or Yara file, and then when an update comes out, at least we can see what the Yara signature is. But unfortunately, a lot of times it's just a dead end because Apple isn't as communicative as they could be.
And is it like one master Yara file with XProtect?
Yeah.
Is it a bunch of, and how many signatures, how many rules are inside the latest update?
I think there's maybe like a few hundred. Let me see if I can pull this up and share it on my screen.
Yeah, that would be quite cool actually. Like if you take like but I don't know if you can have an historical like update, for like all the version like at every quarter, and you map it as a graph, to see like how many like new signatures.
Yeah,
it's still like,
exactly.
It's still like high enough that it's kind of cool to watch the growth, and at the same time, it's not like a big number enough that like that's still relevant to do it. Because
you see my screen?
Let me put it up now. Yeah, I see it now.
So the file is xprotect.yara. It's in System Library Core Services. And if we look at it, it's funny they have a rule for PE binaries too. But then you can just see, let's see, I guess if we do a word count on this, maybe we can see how many signatures.
Oh, just on the rule space, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Word count. I don't know how to do this. Word count. Grab it. Yeah. Okay, so 58 signatures.
Okay, that's and when did they introduce XProtect? Was it last year?
No, it's been around for like 5 or 6 years.
Is it the same thing that they use when the Zoom had a vulnerability and that to remove a file or not? Oh, it's not.
So they have another AV product called MRT, which stands for Malware Removal Tool. And so what XProtect does is XProtect runs every time a file is launched. So it's kind of like an on-demand scanner. What MRT does is it actually will scan the system, and if it detects files that match its signatures, it will actually remove them. So what Apple did in the case of Zoom is they pushed out a signature for Zoom, or specifically the kind of remote component of Zoom that had that vulnerability, and then silently removed it. So this was kind of crazy because, basically it illustrated that Apple has the power to at any time remove any file they want from your system, which is slightly insane. MRT though, the signatures for that are compiled into the MRT binary. So you actually have to go and reverse engineer that to pull those signatures out.
And so an MRT is the new thing, right? All these MRT?
MRT has been around for 5 or so years as well too. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, so that's in we do like strings. I think it's in system library core services. It's MRT.app. No.
By the way, Spender had a look at the Sentinel one stuff, and he says the seed is hard coded at the end of the binary. That's what the mistake they made.
Okay.
Oh,
Well,
no, it's in the not the binary, the file actually. They left the seed in the.
Oh
file
yeah,
across
yeah. They have this like 80 hex 80 byte trailer that they appended, so it makes sense that the key information is in there. So.
And he's saying also too bad in the PE signature in the export act they made a mistake because for the ELFNU field it does not have to be a free C. It can be like any number because it's just an offset, like they can just
yeah, exactly. So but yeah, the export act stuff is interesting. It's a good way to kind of get insight into Mac threats because you can see when Apple pushes out an update. But yeah, it would be great if they shared that information more. Because well, maybe the AV companies want to push out a signature to their users, but Apple basically, I think their mindset is, hey, we've pushed this out to our Exprotect databases, and that covers all Macs, so no one else needs to worry about it. Which is what it is.
Yeah. So there's no way there's no quick way to know like how many signatures inside MRT, huh? Outside of diffing like each MRT version, because
correct.
It's
yeah, it's super annoying. Let's see. Okay.
Yeah, someone in the chat sent that article from Phil Strokes on running diff on the Apple MRT app. I don't know what that is, but
yeah, he provided kind of like how you go through the kind of go through and grep or parse out the signatures. So
got it.
Contents. So if you see on my screen, I usually just dump the strings, and then it's also written in Swift, which makes it really annoying. But they have like family. You can see, for example, they have one for mommy. And so they used to actually embed the names of the actual malware in here. So we can see Xcode Ghost, Eleanor, Wire Lurker,
I see.
Eureka, Netwire, Bunglador, Fruitfly. So then you go and look for basic cross references to that to find their signatures. You can see Hacking Team, Proton, Snake. But yeah, basically you would have to
Pegasus B, Pegasus C. I'm kidding. But imagine in the July update,
Well, look, we'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah, but if you just like keep the counts and you just like map, as some short, and you just do like a D3 like JavaScript short, and you just like put a CSV,
Definitely.
and update your CSV, and you just have a web page that keep track of them, because it's not like there's like tens of thousands, so it's still like interesting to see like the growth rate between each quarter, I think.
Yeah.
Because especially if you're saying that's the third like ransomware you're seeing, it means okay, like maybe people are starting to actually do ransomware more seriously on Mac, So it would be interesting to monitor like those trends.
Yeah, no, it'd be super interesting because I think Apple has the best insight into threats and trends. I'm not sure. I know they subscribe to certain threat intel feeds and stuff like that, but they have access to a lot of private information about malware trends and stuff. So looking at MRT signatures and Exprotect signatures is kind of the best way to gain insight into Apple's insights indirectly. Because when they push out an Exprotect signature, it's basically, or an MRT update. Well, if they push out an Exprotect signature, it's basically an acknowledgement that this is a prevalent threat that they're seeing. They are seeing targeting Mac users. So they basically want to protect Mac users.
Yeah.
When there's an MRT update, that indicates that there's a significant infection that they want to actually proactively disinfect the systems.
Oh, that makes okay. So that basically, if it's in X-Protect, it means it's probably not on VirusTotal. If it's in MRT, it is in VirusTotal.
Yes, exactly. So a good example was fruit fly. When information came out about fruit fly, the FBI had already arrested the alleged creator of that malware. So there was no threat of it spreading anymore. But it was on thousands of systems. So what Apple did is they pushed out an MRT update, but did not push out an X-Protect update, because they basically said the threat is, there's no threat for it to spread more, but we need to disinfect systems that it's already on. So that kind of provides that. So, but yeah, it is interesting though that when they update MRT, they have to like push out an entire update of the binary, right? It's like,
it's a bit strange. Maybe because they're afraid of people like modifying the binary or something, just so they can sign the binary and the database at the same time. I don't know.
But X-Protect stuff is SIP protected, so in theory, it's
I
think it was just
two different teams.
A small project. It's an intern, or maybe not an intern, but like it was like, okay, hey, we should have a simple utility that can clean up these 3 or 4 malware samples, and then it kind of grew and grew and grew, and so they're just kind of pigeonholed into that approach.
Yeah, that would definitely make sense. Probably like, yeah. But if you're saying it's been already like 5-6 years, huh?
Yeah. I think it was. Yeah, it's been around for a while. So.
Okay.
Yeah, Apple doesn't like talk about it because it brings attention to it. So.
Yeah, because for some reason I thought it was like released just for like the Zoom stuff.
No, they've. I think that was the first instance of them using it to remove non-malicious code, right? I mean, no one cares if you release malware, but Cupertino automatically pushing out an update to remove components from your system, like, I mean, that's a pretty. I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah,
it's a pretty aggressive step.
But yeah. I don't know if we have more questions in the chat. I do not think so. Yeah, like outside of Spender, already looked at the GitHub repository and figured out all the algorithm was working in less than a minute.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to take a peek at that.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, thanks for the presentation. It was really cool, and really good to be able to see like part 1 and part 2 in one block. I think it's really awesome because, like you said, there is not that many ransomware. It's great to get a good peek at it, and also to get all the content at once. And presenting a blog post actually I think is a pretty good model. I did that 2 weeks ago also. I think it works great, so don't do the work twice.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I mean, it kind of allowed me to kind of rapidly present existing content.
No, I think it's awesome. I did it also like 2 weeks ago. It works great. Yeah. Also, like if you cannot present your blog post, it means you are missing some parts to it. So you're like, oh, maybe like you have to rewrite it. So it's a good exercise too.
Yeah, definitely. It's very comprehensive. So, well, thanks again for having me on. I'm already looking forward to OpCode 2021, coming back to Dubai, riding some camels and some Lamborghinis.
I don't know if I'm still going to do it next year. To be honest, I'm not sure if I'm still going to do the physical version again, because it's a lot of like logistic and stress and stuff.
So much work. Yeah.
And like doing the virtual stuff is pretty easy, but it's not the same. But at the same time, doing it like a physical event, it's kind of tricky, unless I would do it like in another country where it would like be fun, like what we did in Kenya, so it made sense to like do like the event in a new country because like the local community can benefit,
Yeah. Well, keep me in mind. I'd love to, come talk nerdy in person.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, well, thanks again for coming, and talk to you soon.
All right, thanks, Matt. Aloha. Bye.
Aloha. Bye. So I guess do it in Paris. I did I did a conference in Paris like 10 years ago. we had it was called Akito Ergosum. I think we did like 2 or 3 edition, and then we renamed it to No Such Con, which was something running for 3 years, and yeah, and it was all English content. Because back then all the security conferences were all in French, and it was a good excuse to bring people to come to Paris. People really liked it. We had a lot of really good speakers actually, and yeah, so that was pretty successful too. And yeah, then we all moved out of France and everything, so we didn't really have you know, the time and the opportunity to do it. It's a bit difficult, you know, when you're not there locally. Yeah, I mean, I think like in France now there is a lot of really good like conferences. Like 10 years ago, it was a bit like you know, you had some really good ones like Stick, but it was only in French, for instance. Now Stick, they do accept some English content. You know, it's quite frequent that they have like English speakers, like that Matt Miller is here, for instance. So obviously, would present in English. Great guy. Nuit du Hack. I think they started around the same time as us, or like a year after, but they still have been running the conference. I think now it's like it's pretty good English content also. So that's you know, that's pretty good, you know. So we're quite happy to like kind of like kickstart like at least like English conferences for security in France, you know, because like yeah, like people like doing the Nuit du Hack and everything, they still have been doing it because it's a lot of work and effort. So they've been doing a really good job at still doing the conference. And I think there's a lot, even like less technical conferences, like the FIC one in Lille, for instance. That one also, I mean, it's not very technical, but I think it's really popular now also. So that's also like pretty good. Yeah, but BotConf also is also pretty good. There is also one in Bordeaux. I forgot the name. They're done by some CTF people. They're like also like pretty good. But yeah, France always had like a lot of reverse engineer, like just like Germany. Just like the Germans are much better than the French, you know, at doing events. So CCC has been like very consistent and everything. In France, like everyone started to do their own stuff and no one collaborates. But it's a different approach. But yeah, ST Hack maybe actually. Let me check. ST, I think that's the one. Canley, yeah, I think that's the one. What's the name of the team website? ST Hack. Yeah, I think that's the one. I think you're right. I think that's the one I was thinking about. Also, there is. I mean, now there is a lot of stuff. Even like the ANSYs have like their own Discord group for like that cybersecurity competition. There is also what's the name? ATFM. Those guys. They've been doing also their. I don't know if they have a conference yet. Oh yeah, they definitely do. 2018. Yeah, they are like pretty good too. Like their Discord is super active. They're like really awesome people also. I mean, it's pretty cool. No, there's like so many things. Like I'm sure there is more that I don't even know about. But you know, like things like MISC. You know, it's crazy that MISC is still around. Like I remember, I was a teenager. I was reading MISC. You know, and it is still around. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, it's really awesome. Yeah, but like which I spend their favorite conference is H2HC in Brazil. Like but same thing, like H2HC in Brazil, they've been around for like forever. It's probably been I don't know, like 15 years, I think, at least. So yeah, that's pretty good. Speaking of good stuff, I don't know if you guys saw this blog post about the last bugs from Piotr. It was pretty good. There is a bunch of like bugs in remote FX. I just saw it like today. I didn't really have time to read it yet, but it seemed like it was pretty cool. A bunch of like vulnerabilities in the shaders. I don't even know you run a vertex shader. But yeah, like he has a bunch of bugs like in Intel and AMD drivers and DLL, I think. So that's a lot of like guest to host vulnerabilities. So that's yeah, that seemed like pretty cool. I guess that's how you do it. But yeah, like that's it's a lot of vulnerabilities. I think he has like around like 10. Some really good stuff, like the ATI one. But we cannot see the call stack properly. But yeah, that seems quite good. I was telling JZL the other day should stop looking at Win32k. Like there's a lot of stuff with DirectX. I guess if you just look at shaders in general, you're gonna find like a lot of stuff too. Oh really? Huh? AMD made the fixes, but not Intel. Oh wow! Like usually that's the opposite. Intel is faster than AMD to fix those stuff, and like Intel drivers are like usually also better. Interesting. Yeah, I mean fixed it by disabling the feature. I guess they mitigated it, huh? It's kind of yeah, I guess they just gave up because there's too many vulnerabilities. Like if you, I mean, you can tell, you know, if he has like how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You have like 10 bugs in 2 different. You can be sure there's like another like 20 hiding, you know. But actually here, did you see this? Elected disabling remote FX vGPU from Hyper-V to fix this issue, with full removal of remote FX vGPU planned for a future date. I guess it's just gonna get rid of it. But yeah, because remote FX is bad. I think it was an acquisition from Microsoft. I forgot which company, but but I think it's an acquisition that happened like oh, Windows 2008. Okay, yeah, it's been like 10 years. Acquired and Calista Technology, yeah. Yeah, 2008. Not bad. Not bad, not bad. Cool. Well, I guess that's the end for today. Thanks everyone for watching. And like I was saying, like in 2 weeks is gonna be the last episode, at least with this format. We're gonna have a bunch of like round table if you want to speak, or if there is anyone you would like to see speaking or anything, let me know. So I'm not quite sure how the schedule is gonna look like, but since it's gonna probably be the last edition for this season, yeah, it's because I don't want it to be too long either, because then it's attention drop, but yeah. And then I'll probably take a break from it and see, maybe I'd like to find like another format or something in that sense, because there's a lot of stuff to cover every time. Even news-wise, actually, there's a lot of stuff going on. Like, for instance, like the stuff that happened today with NSO and the Catalan government. I mean, I'm not sure I even understood if they were from a new batch of attacks, if it was still like the same one as last year with more details being released. So yeah, I think that's also something that could be interesting to cover. But yeah, so July 29 is gonna be the next one, and at least like the last episode until I don't know, either month or a few months. We'll see. We will see. But yeah, so I guess that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, recommendations, or want to continue the chat, you can always come on the Discord server. Everyone is there, and even now, actually, if you go on the website, yeah, you have the list of people. See, there's like 80 people online just on the Discord channel now. So it is quite active. But yeah, so if you want to keep joining the discussion, yeah, come join us on Discord. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you have no more questions, I guess I will say bye to you and see you in 2 weeks. Take care.